London, 1858. The November rain drummed against the narrow attic window of the townhouse on Clarges Street, each drop a small percussion marking the passage of another grey afternoon in a life that had grown accustomed to grey afternoons. Eleanor Ashworth sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, her dark wool dress pooling around her like spilled ink, and lifted the lid of a camphor wood box that had accompanied her through 38 years of life, though most of its contents spoke only to the first 18. The attic smelled of dust and old lavender, of things carefully preserved but rarely visited, and the single window allowed just enough pale light to illuminate the treasures she had spread before her like an archaeologist examining artifacts from a civilization long extinct. There were ribbons once white, but now yellowed to the color of old ivory, their satin surfaces cracked where they had been folded too long in the same creases. There were dried flowers, roses mostly, that crumbled at the slightest touch, their fragrance long departed, leaving only the ghost of what they had beaten. There were letters in a young girl's enthusiastic hand, written to school friends whose faces Eleanor could no longer quite conjure, and a small leather volume of poetry with her maiden initials embossed in gold on the cover, though the gold had mostly flaked away. But it was the dance cards that held her attention now, as they always did when she opened this box, as they had done perhaps 100 times over the years, in moments of melancholy or reminiscence or simple curiosity about the girl she had once been to. There were 12 of them in all, each one an elegant rectangle of thick ivory cardstock edged in gold filigree, each one bearing the name of a different ball or assembly from the London season of 1838, and each one, every single one, completely blank. Eleanor lifted the first card, running her finger along the printed lines where gentlemen's names should have been inscribed, where promises of waltzes and quadrilles and country dances should have been recorded, where evidence of her desirability and social success should have been permanently marked. The card from the Hartley Ball, April 1838. Not a single line filled. The card from the Montrose Assembly, May 1838. Empty. The Cavendish Musicale, the Pemberton Supper Dance, the Grand G finale at Almack's itself. All blank, all unsigned, all testament to a season spent standing against silk-papered walls while other girls whirled past in the arms of eager gentlemen. She had kept them, she told herself, as a reminder that her worth was not determined by such superficial measures, but the care with which she had preserved them, the frequency with which she revisited them, suggested a wound that had never quite healed, a question that had never been answered about why she had been so thoroughly overlooked. The sound of footsteps on the narrow attic stairs pulled Eleanor from her reverie, and she looked up to see her niece Charlotte emerging into the dusty space, her young face flushed from the climb, her golden curls escaping from their pins in a way that would have horrified her mother, but which made her look charmingly dishevelled. Charlotte was 19th, the same age Eleanor had been during that long-ago debut season, and she possessed the same relation to Eleanor's sister Catherine as Eleanor once had to Catherine herself, which was to say she lived perpetually in the shadow of greater beauty. But where Eleanor had responded to this condition by retreating into books and resignation, Charlotte maintained an irrepressible optimism that Eleanor found both touching and faintly exhausting. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the scene before her, the opened box, the scattered mementos, and most particularly the array of dance cards spread across the floor like a fortune-teller's cards offering glimpses into the past. "Aunt Eleanor!" Charlotte exclaimed, settling herself on the floor with the unself-conscious grace of youth. "I have been searching everywhere for you. Mamma said you had disappeared after luncheon, and I thought perhaps you had gone for a walk despite the rain. But here you are in the attic with what are those?" Eleanor smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes, and gestured to the cards. "Relics of my youth, dear Charlotte. Evidence of a season spent learning that not all young ladies are destined for the pleasures of the ballroom. Charlotte picked up the nearest card, the one from the Montrose Assembly, and examined it with a small frown creasing her smooth forehead. But, Aunt, these are dance cards, are they not? The printed lines for gentlemen's names, the order of dances listed. Yet they are all blank. Why would you keep dance cards with no names written on them? The question, asked with such genuine puzzlement, struck Eleanor with unexpected force, and for a moment she could not answer, could only look at these artifacts of her invisible youth and wonder herself why she had preserved them so carefully all these years. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, though something in her chest tightened painfully. Because no gentleman ever requested my hand for a dance during my entire debut season. Charlotte, not one, not a single waltz or quadrille or even a simple country dance. I attended every major ball and assembly that season, wore the gowns my mother had made especially for the occasion, learned all the steps from the dancing master, practiced my conversation and my posture and my smile. But when the music began, I stood against the wall and watched as every other girl was led onto the floor. The cards remained blank because no one ever asked to sign them. Charlotte's expression shifted from puzzlement to shock, her mouth forming a small O of disbelief. But Aunt Eleanor, that cannot be. You are so accomplished, so well-read and clever and kind. How could no gentleman have asked you to dance? Eleanor reached out and gently took the card from Charlotte's hand, tracing the empty lines with her finger in a gesture she had performed so many times it had become almost ritual. Beauty and youth are the currency of the marriage mart, my dear, and I possessed neither in sufficient quantity. Oh, I was young enough in years, but I lacked the vivacity and sparkle that draws gentlemen's attention. I was too serious, too bookish, too inclined to honest conversation rather than flattering nonsense. And most importantly, I had the great misfortune of having a sister who possessed beauty and charm in such abundance that she eclipsed every other girl in the room, myself most especially. Your mother, Charlotte said quietly, and it was not a question. Eleanor nodded. Catherine was 17 that season, making her debut a year before custom strictly required because she was already so polished, so ready for society. She had golden hair that caught the candlelight, a laugh that made gentlemen smile, and a way of making each man feel as though he were the only person in the room. I loved her desperately, as I still do, but I also learned that season what it meant to be invisible. To stand 3 feet away from someone who commands all attention and realize that you might as well not exist. Every ball, every assembly, I would position myself near the refreshment table or by the potted palms, and I would watch Catherine's dance card fill within the first quarter hour while mine remained pristine. By the end of the season, I had stopped bringing them at all, but these 12 I kept, perhaps as a reminder of that time, perhaps as a sort of penance. I am not entirely sure. Charlotte's eyes had filled with tears, and she reached out to grasp Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. That is the cruelest thing I have ever heard, Aunt. How did you bear it? How did you survive watching your own sister receive all the attention while you were left alone? Eleanor squeezed her niece's hand, touched by the girl's fierce empathy. I bore it because I had no choice, and because I eventually came to understand that my worth was not determined by whether a gentleman signed a card or asked me to waltz. I found other sources of meaning, other ways to fill my life. I read voraciously, I studied art and music and languages. I traveled when I could afford it. I involved myself in charitable works. I built a life that had substance and purpose, even if it lacked the romantic fulfillment that society tells us is the pinnacle of female existence. And now, at 38, I am content with my choices, or at least I have made peace with them. The rain had intensified, drumming harder against the roof, and the light from the small window had dimmed to a pearly grey that made the attic feel even more like a place outside of time, a pocket universe where past and present existed simultaneously. Charlotte studied her aunt's face with an intensity that suggested she was seeing her clearly for the first time, looking past the familiar figure of Aunt Eleanor, who supervised her reading and corrected her French and occasionally accompanied her to modest social gatherings, and seeing instead a woman with her own history of disappointment and resilience. "But you kept them," Charlotte said softly, gesturing to the dance cards. "If you had truly made peace with that season, if you had truly found your worth elsewhere, would you not have discarded these long ago? They serve no practical purpose. They hold no happy memories. Yet here they are, preserved as carefully as if they were precious." Eleanor felt her composure waver, felt the carefully constructed narrative she had built around her spinsterhood begin to crack at the edges. "You are wiser than your years, Charlotte," she said, her voice not quite steady. "You are right, of course. I have told myself for 20 years that these cards are merely curiosities, reminders of a different time, objects of historical interest about the cruelty and superficiality of the marriage market. But the truth is more complicated." She paused, gathering the cards together and holding them against her chest, as though they were something precious, or perhaps something that needed to be contained. "I kept them because they are proof that I existed during that season, even if no one noticed. I kept them because destroying them would feel like erasing that girl entirely, the earnest, hopeful young woman who believed that perhaps someone might see past her plain face and quiet manner to the person underneath. I kept them because, even now, 2 decades later, there is a part of me that wonders what I lacked, what essential quality of femininity or charm I was born without that rendered me so thoroughly invisible. And I kept them," she admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "because they remind me that my worth is not determined by whether a gentleman signed a card, and I have spent 20 years needing that reminder almost daily." The two women sat in silence for a long moment, the rain and the gathering dusk creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. Charlotte still held her aunt's hand, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of determination that reminded Eleanor of herself at that age, before disappointment had taught her to lower her expectations. "I think, Aunt Eleanor, that those gentlemen were fools, and that their failure to ask you to dance says everything about their lack of discernment and nothing about your worth. And I think that somewhere in London there must be a gentleman with enough intelligence to recognize what they missed." Eleanor smiled sadly and began gathering the cards back into their box, each one carefully placed so as not to bend or damage them. "That is kind of you, dear, but I am 38 years old and well past the age of such romantic notions. Whatever chances I might have had have long since passed. I am content with my life as it is, truly. I have my books, my music, my charitable work with the Foundling Hospital, and I have you and your mother, however complicated that relationship may be. I do not need a gentleman to validate my existence." Charlotte looked as though she wanted to argue further, but something in Eleanor's expression forestalled her, and instead she simply helped gather the remaining mementos back into the camphorwood box. As they worked in companionable silence, Eleanor found herself looking once more at the blank dance cards, at those pristine lines that had never been filled, and felt the familiar ache of old rejection mixed with something else, something she could not quite name. It was the feeling of unfinished business, of a story that had ended too abruptly, of music that had stopped before the final movement. She closed the lid of the box and latched it firmly, as though she could contain not just the physical objects, but also the emotions they evoked, and followed Charlotte down the narrow stairs toward the warmth and light of the house below, leaving the attic and its treasured emptiness behind, though not, she knew, forgotten. The next afternoon arrived with the brittle sunshine that sometimes follows London rain, the kind of pale November light that illuminates without warming, and Eleanor found herself walking the familiar route to Lady Pemberton's townhouse in Mayfair, her steps quickening as the chill air bit through her wool cloak. Lady Pemberton was one of the few remnants of Eleanor's debut season who had maintained a connection with her across the intervening decades, though their friendship had less to do with that shared history, and more to do with Lady Pemberton's genuine appreciation for intelligent conversation, a quality she found lamentably rare among her social circle. The widow of a minor diplomat, Lady Pemberton occupied a unique position in society as a woman of impeccable breeding and modest means, who moved freely between various social strata, equally comfortable discussing philosophy with blue-stockings or exchanging gossip with matrons, and her drawing-room had become something of a salon for those who valued substance over spectacle. Eleanor was shown into the familiar blue and gold drawing-room by a maid who had served Lady Pemberton for at least 2 decades, and she found her hostess already seated near the fire, the tea service arranged on a low table between 2 comfortable chairs that had molded themselves over years to the shapes of their occupants. Lady Pemberton herself was perhaps 65, with silver hair arranged in a simple style that required neither elaborate pinning nor youthful affectation, and she possessed the sort of handsome features that improved with age rather than fading, her face bearing the character of a life fully lived. "My dear Eleanor," Lady Pemberton said warmly, rising to embrace her guest with the easy affection of long friendship, "how fortuitous that you should call today. I have the most extraordinary piece of news, the sort that has set every drawing-room in London buzzing with speculation." Eleanor settled into her accustomed chair and accepted a cup of tea, noting with amusement that Lady Pemberton had barely waited for the conventional pleasantries before launching into her topic. "You know I am not one for gossip," she said with a small smile, "but I confess I am curious what could cause such widespread excitement." Lady Pemberton leaned forward with the air of someone about to impart intelligence of genuine significance. "The Duke of Ashford has returned to London after 15 years abroad. Thomas Bancroft. Do you remember him from your season? He was already titled then, though only recently, having inherited from his uncle just the year before." Eleanor's hand stilled on her teacup, and for a moment she could not speak, could not move, could only hear that name echoing in her mind like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Thomas Bancroft, the Duke of Ashford. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 20 years, had not permitted herself to think it except in the deepest privacy of her own thoughts, yet here it was, dropped casually into Lady Pemberton's elegant drawing-room as though it were mere gossip rather than something that sent tremors through the carefully constructed foundations of Eleanor's composure. "I remember him slightly," Eleanor managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady, even as her pulse quickened. "He was not in London very long that season, if I recall. He married an Italian heiress rather suddenly and departed for the continent." Lady Pemberton nodded vigorously, clearly delighted to have an audience for her intelligence. Francesca Morelli, the daughter of a Venetian banking family. "They say the marriage was arranged to save the Ashford estates from financial ruin, as the old Duke had been rather profligate and left considerable debts. Thomas Bancroft did his duty, married the girl, took her fortune, and carried her off to Italy where they lived for 5 years before tragedy struck. She died in childbirth, along with the infant, and the Duke has been in self-imposed exile ever since. 15 years in Venice and Florence and Rome, never returning to England even once, as though he could not bear to face the life he had left behind." Eleanor sipped her tea carefully, using the mundane action to steady herself. "That is terribly sad. To lose a wife and child must be a grief beyond imagining." Lady Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. Indeed, though those who knew him before say the marriage was one of convenience rather than affection. Still, guilt can be as powerful as grief, perhaps more so. They say he has changed entirely. The man who left England was full of life and charm, quick to laugh, generous with his attention. The man who returned is described as grave, withdrawn, almost ghostly in his demeanour, as though the best part of him died in that Italian villa, and only the shell returned to London. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, a strange mixture of sorrow and recognition. "Perhaps we all become ghosts of who we were meant to be," she said softly, more to herself than to her companion. "Life has a way of extracting its toll, and we pay with the parts of ourselves that were most vital." Lady Pemberton regarded her with sharp eyes that missed very little. "That is unusually melancholic, even for you, my dear. Do you have some particular connection to the Duke that I am not aware of?" Eleanor shook her head, perhaps too quickly. "No, we were never introduced formally. I merely remember seeing him at one or two events during my season. He cut a striking figure, as I recall, handsome, well-mannered, much sought after by the mothers of eligible daughters. But then he left rather abruptly, and I confess I gave him little thought afterward." The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but Eleanor had long ago learned that some truths were too precious and too painful to be shared, even with friends. The reality was that she remembered Thomas Bancroft with a clarity that frightened her, remembered him with the kind of detail that suggested her young heart had catalogued every glimpse she had caught of him during that season. She remembered his height, the way he stood a full head taller than most men in a ballroom, and the breadth of his shoulders beneath perfectly tailored evening coats. She remembered his dark hair that held a slight wave despite being smoothed back with pomade, and the way one lock would sometimes fall forward across his forehead when he bowed. She remembered his laugh, rich and genuine, carrying across crowded rooms and making her wish she could be the cause of such unguarded joy. And most of all, she remembered the Montrose Ball in May of 1838, when she had been standing near the potted palms that lined the ballroom, half hidden as was her custom, and he had walked past so close that she caught the scent of his cologne, something with notes of sandalwood and bergamot. For one extraordinary moment their eyes had met, his grey eyes looking directly into hers, and she had felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it had stolen her breath. But then someone had called his name, and he had turned away, and she had convinced herself over the years that she had imagined the intensity of that brief connection, that it had meant nothing to him, even if it had meant everything to her foolish young heart. Lady Pemberton was watching her with an expression that suggested she suspected more than Eleanor was willing to admit, but mercifully she did not press the point. "Well?" she said, pouring more tea into both their cups. "Regardless of your personal connection or lack thereof, the Duke's return has certainly created quite a stir. He has taken up residence in the Ashford House in Berkeley Square, which has been closed these 15 years and required an army of servants to make habitable again. He has been seen walking in the park, attending a performance at the theatre, and calling upon various members of his family. Mrs. Whitmore reports that he looks older than his years, which I suppose is to be expected given his history, and that he shows no interest in the social entertainments that once occupied him. He declined Lady Hertford's invitation to her annual ball, and he has not appeared at any of the usual gatherings where a duke would be expected to show himself." Eleanor listened to this recitation of the Duke's movements with an attention she could not quite suppress, even as she told herself that his presence in London was a matter of complete indifference to her. "What brings him back now?" she asked, attempting to sound merely politely curious. "After 15 years, why return at all?" Lady Pemberton shrugged elegantly. "Estate business, one assumes. Properties to inspect, accounts to review, tenants to visit." The duties of a dukedom cannot be managed entirely from abroad, no matter how skilled one's steward, and perhaps after 15 years of exaltoire, even grief becomes a more portable burden. Perhaps he simply grew tired of running from his past and decided to face whatever awaits him in England. The conversation moved on to other topics: the engagement of a mutual acquaintance, the new exhibition at the Royal Academy, the shocking price of coal this winter. But Eleanor found herself only half listening, her mind circling obsessively around the news of Thomas Bancroft's return. When she finally took her leave and walked back through the darkening streets toward her modest townhouse, she felt as though the London she had inhabited just hours before had subtly shifted, as though his presence in the city had altered some fundamental aspect of her reality, even though they moved in completely different spheres and would almost certainly never encounter one another. She arrived home to find Charlotte in the small sitting room attempting to master a complicated piece on the pianoforte, and the girl looked up with a smile as Eleanor entered. "How was Lady Pemberton, Aunt? Did she have any interesting gossip to share?" Eleanor removed her cloak and gloves, considering how to answer. "The Duke of Ashford has returned to London after many years abroad," she said, aiming for a neutral tone. "It has caused quite a sensation in certain circles." Charlotte's fingers stilled on the keys. "The Duke of Ashford. Is that the gentleman who lost his wife and child in Italy? I have heard Mamma speak of him. She says he was quite the prize during his season, handsome and charming and much pursued." Eleanor nodded, moving toward the fire to warm her chilled hands. "So I understand, though I knew him only slightly. It was many years ago, and I was not part of the circle that would have claimed his attention." The maid appeared then with a small silver salver bearing a single card, and Eleanor felt her heart lurch in her chest even before she saw what was written there. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ashworth," the maid said, "but this was delivered by a footman in ducal livery just a quarter-hour ago. He said it required no immediate reply, but that his master hoped for a response by tomorrow morning." Eleanor took the card with fingers that trembled slightly, and even in the dim firelight she could see the quality of the heavy cream cardstock, the elegant engraving, the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Ashford embossed in the corner. She broke the seal with care and unfolded the single sheet of paper, her eyes moving over the words, written in a bold, masculine hand. "Miss Eleanor Ashworth," the note began, using the formal address appropriate for an unmarried woman, though the use of her given name suggested a presumption of familiarity that set her pulse racing. "I hope you will forgive the liberty of my writing to you without the benefit of a formal introduction, though I believe we were briefly acquainted during the season of 1838. I have recently returned to London after an extended absence, and I find myself wishing to renew certain connections from that time. Would you do me the honor of receiving me tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock? I have a matter of some delicacy I wish to discuss with you, and I believe you may be the only person in London who can provide me with the information I seek. I remain your obedient servant, Thomas Bancroft, Duke of Ashford." Eleanor read the note 3 times, each reading failing to make it any more comprehensible than the first. Charlotte had abandoned the pianoforte and crossed to her aunt's side, her young face alight with curiosity. "What is it, Aunt Eleanor? You have gone quite pale. Is it bad news?" Eleanor looked up from the note, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no rational explanation. "The Duke of Ashford has requested permission to call upon me tomorrow afternoon," she said, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. "I cannot imagine why. We were never properly introduced. We certainly never had any conversation of substance, and I cannot conceive what matter of delicacy he could possibly wish to discuss with me." Charlotte's eyes widened. "A duke wishes to call on you? Aunt Eleanor, that is extraordinary. You must receive him, of course. You cannot refuse such a request." "Can I not?" Eleanor murmured, sinking into the nearest chair with the note still clutched in her hand. "Charlotte, I am a woman of 38 with no fortune, no connections, no beauty, and no social standing beyond what my family name provides. Dukes do not call upon women like me unless there is some very specific purpose, and I cannot think what that purpose might be. Perhaps he wishes to discuss charity work, Charlotte suggested helpfully. Or perhaps he needs someone to translate Italian documents. You are quite fluent in Italian. Are you not? Or perhaps there is some connection through your family that you have forgotten. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Any of those explanations would require him to know something about my current circumstances, my accomplishments, my family connections. But we have had no contact in 20 years. How would he even know I am in London, let alone where I reside or what my interests might be? The logical course would be to politely decline, to write a brief note explaining that she is not equipped to help him with whatever mysterious matter concerns him, to maintain the boundaries that have kept her safe and unnoticed for 2 decades. But even as Eleanor thought this, she knew she would not refuse him, could not refuse him, because the young girl who had once stood near the potted palms watching him across a ballroom was not entirely dead, and she desperately wanted to know why he remembered her, if indeed he did remember her, and this was not simply some case of mistaken identity or confused recollection. That night, after Charlotte had retired and the house had grown quiet around her, Eleanor lit a candle and climbed the stairs to the attic once more. She retrieved the camphor-wood box and carried it back down to her bedroom, setting it on the small writing desk near the window. The rain had returned, drumming softly against the glass, and in the flickering candlelight she opened the box and withdrew the dance cards, spreading them before her like a fortune-teller's tarot. The Montrose Ball, May 1838. She picked up that particular card and held it close to the candle flame, studying the blank lines as though they might suddenly reveal hidden writing, some secret message that would explain why a duke she had glimpsed only briefly 20 years ago would now seek her company. "Why?" she whispered to the empty room, to the rain and the darkness, and her own reflection ghostly in the window glass. Why, after 20 years, would he remember I exist? The cards offered no answer, maintaining their pristine silence as they had for 2 decades. But tomorrow, Eleanor knew, she would receive the Duke of Ashford in her modest drawing-room, and perhaps then she would learn what connection, what hidden thread, had wound through the years to bind them together across the vast distance of time and circumstance, and all that might have been, but never was. The clock in Eleanor's modest drawing-room chimed the 1/4 hour before 3, and she found herself standing at the window for perhaps the 10th time in as many minutes, her hands smoothing the fabric of her gown with a nervous gesture she could not seem to suppress. She had chosen her most respectable dress, a day gown of deep burgundy wool with modest trim and a high neckline that she knew was at least 3 years behind current fashion, but which had the virtue of making her look dignified rather than desperate. Her hair had been arranged and rearranged by her own hands, as she could not afford a lady's maid for such trivial occasions, and she had settled finally on a simple style that pulled the chestnut strands, now threaded with silver, away from her face and coiled them at the nape of her neck. She had placed fresh flowers on the side table that morning, chrysanthemums in autumnal shades of gold and bronze that she had purchased from the flower seller on the corner at an extravagant price, and she had instructed her single housemaid to prepare tea and lay out the few nice biscuits they kept for company, though what a duke would make of her humble refreshments she could not imagine. The drawing-room itself seemed to have shrunk overnight, its modest proportions suddenly appearing shabby rather than cozy, the worn patches on the upholstery visible in the clear November light, the faded wallpaper showing its age in a way Eleanor had stopped noticing years ago, but which now seemed painfully obvious. This was not a room designed to receive a duke, and she was not a woman prepared to entertain one. Yet here she stood, watching the street below for the arrival of a carriage that would bring Thomas Bancroft back into her life after 20 years of absence. At precisely 3 o'clock, a hansom cab pulled up before her narrow townhouse, and Eleanor watched as a tall figure emerged, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the chill wind that had picked up since morning. Even from above, even after 2 decades, she recognized something essential in the way he carried himself, a quality of bearing that transcended age or circumstance, though she could see immediately that Lady Pemberton had been correct in saying he looked older than his 55 years. His hair, which had been dark as coal in his youth, had gone almost entirely silver, and even from this distance she could see the lines that grief and time had carved into his face. He paid the driver and stood for a moment looking up at her house, his expression unreadable, and Eleanor stepped back from the window quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that seemed absurd for a woman of 38, who should long ago have outgrown such adolescent reactions. She heard the knock at the door, heard her maid's footsteps in the hall, heard the murmur of voices as the Duke was admitted and divested of his coat and hat. And then the door to the drawing-room opened, and he was there, filling her small space with his presence in a way that seemed to alter the very air she breathed. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep and cultured, with a slight roughness at the edges that suggested emotion held carefully in check. "Thank you for agreeing to receive me. I know my request must have seemed strange, and I am grateful for your forbearance." Eleanor curtsied, the gesture automatic after years of training, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. "Your Grace," she managed, pleased that her voice emerged clear and composed despite the chaos of her thoughts. "You are most welcome. Please, won't you sit?" She gestured to the better of her 2 armchairs, positioned near the fire, and he moved toward it with a slight hesitation in his step, as though he too felt the strangeness of this encounter. As he sat, she noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, a barely perceptible tremor that suggested he was not nearly as composed as his formal manner implied. This observation steadied her somehow, the knowledge that she was not alone in her nervousness, and she took her own seat with marginally more grace than she had feared she could manage. For a moment they sat in silence, the social conventions that should have guided their conversation seeming inadequate to the weight of whatever had brought him here. Eleanor found herself studying his face with an attention that would have been rude in any other circumstance, noting how the years had refined his features rather than coarsening them, how his grey eyes, the same color as a winter sea, held depths of sorrow that had not been present in his youth, but which somehow made him more rather than less compelling. He was looking at her with equal intensity, and she felt color rise in her cheeks as she became acutely aware of every imperfection, every line that time had etched around her eyes and mouth, every strand of silver in her hair that marked her as a woman well past her prime. "Your Grace," she began, attempting to break the silence before it became unbearable, "your note mentioned a matter of some delicacy that you wished to discuss. How may I be of assistance to you?" The Duke leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped before him in a gesture that seemed almost supplicating. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Forgive me. This is more difficult than I anticipated. I have rehearsed what I wished to say 100 times since deciding to call upon you, and now that I am here, I find that all my careful words have deserted me." He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice held a note of something raw and unguarded. "You do not remember me, Miss Ashworth, but I remember you." Eleanor felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her chair. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, but we were introduced at the Montrose Ball in 1838, were we not? Surely you cannot think I would forget meeting a duke, even briefly." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We were introduced, yes, for perhaps 30 seconds in a receiving line, where I exchanged pleasantries with 50 other people whose names and faces I have long since forgotten. But that is not what I mean when I say I remember you. I mean that I remember you specifically, individually, with a clarity that defies reason given how briefly we actually spoke." Eleanor's hand went unconsciously to her hair, tucking back a strand that had already been perfectly secured, a nervous gesture left over from youth. "I do not understand, Your Grace." The Duke's eyes never left her face, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch, a tenderness mixed with regret that spoke of emotions long held in check. "You wore a pale green dress that evening," he said softly, his voice taking on the cadence of memory. Not the vivid greens that were fashionable that season, but something softer, the color of new leaves in spring. You were standing near the potted palms at the south end of the ballroom, partially obscured by the fronds as though you wished to disappear into the foliage entirely. And you were reading a book, Paradise Lost, if I am not mistaken, which you had hidden behind one of the larger pots so that the chaperones would not see and scold you for being unladylike. You looked as though you would rather be anywhere else in the world than at that ball. And I remember thinking that you were the only honest person in the entire room because everyone else was pretending to enjoy themselves, while you alone had the courage to acknowledge that the whole spectacle was rather tedious. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling, because every detail he had mentioned was precisely, impossibly correct. She had worn her pale green dress that evening, the one her mother had declared too insipid, but which Eleanor had loved for its quiet elegance. She had positioned herself near the palms because they provided cover, and because no gentleman ever looked for a dancing partner in the shadows. And she had indeed brought Milton's Paradise Lost, the small leather-bound edition that fit in her reticule, and she had read it in stolen moments when she was certain no one was watching. But how could he possibly remember such specifics when they had barely exchanged a dozen words, when she had been just one unremarkable young woman among hundreds at that crowded ball? She began, then stopped, unable to formulate a coherent response. "Your Grace, I do not know what to say. We spoke for less than a minute, as you yourself acknowledged. How can you possibly remember such details after 20 years? The Duke's expression grew even more serious, and he leaned back in his chair, as though needing the physical distance to maintain his composure. "Some moments, Miss Ashworth, mark us more deeply than we realize at the time," he said quietly. "That evening at the Montrose ball was such a moment for me, though I did not fully understand why until years later. You see, I had just become engaged that very afternoon to Francesca Morelli, the marriage contract signed by our respective families, my fate sealed in exchange for the fortune that would save my estates from ruin. I attended the ball that evening in a state of profound ambivalence, playing my role as the eligible duke while knowing I had just relinquished any claim to choosing my own future. And then I saw you, tucked away among the palms with your contraband book, looking so utterly removed from the mercenary calculations that governed everyone else in that room, and I felt something I had not expected to feel." He paused, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I felt envy," he continued. "Envy of your apparent freedom to simply be yourself, to refuse to participate in the charade, to value your own preferences over society's expectations. And I felt curiosity, a desire to know what you were reading, what you were thinking, whether you found Milton's Satan as compelling as I did. Most of all, I felt a recognition, as though in that crowded ballroom filled with strangers, I had glimpsed someone who might understand what it meant to feel fundamentally at odds with the world we were born into. Eleanor found her voice, though it emerged barely above a whisper. But you were engaged to be married. You left for Italy within the month. Why would you remember a woman you saw for such a brief moment, a woman of no consequence who could offer you nothing? His eyes met hers with an intensity that sent heat through her entire body. That is precisely why I remembered you, Miss Ashworth. Because you offered nothing except the possibility of genuine connection, and I was about to enter a marriage where such connection was impossible. I have thought of you more times than I can count over these 20 years, wondered what became of the woman in the pale green dress, whether she married, whether she found happiness, whether she still read Milton in secret at tedious social gatherings. And when I returned to London and made inquiries through Lady Pemberton, who I knew maintained wide connections, and learned that you were here, unmarried, still yourself as far as I could determine, I knew I had to see you again before I returned to Italy. Eleanor's mind was racing, trying to reconcile this extraordinary confession with everything she had believed about her invisible youth, about her fundamental undesirability, about the season when no one had noticed her existence. But you never approached me after that brief introduction, she said, and she could hear the note of accusation creeping into her voice, despite her best efforts. If I made such an impression, why did you not speak to me, ask me to dance, acknowledge me in some way beyond a glance across a crowded room? The Duke's expression filled with regret so profound it was almost painful to witness. Because I was a coward, Miss Ashworth. Because I was engaged to another woman, and honor demanded I maintain the boundaries appropriate to that commitment. Because I told myself that my momentary fascination with you was merely the rebellion of a man about to enter a cage of his own making, that it would pass once I left England and began my new life. And perhaps most shamefully, because I convinced myself that you would not welcome the attention of a man who could offer you nothing but complications, that it would be kinder to leave you undisturbed than to draw you into the mess of my circumstances. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored coat. I was wrong on all counts, he said, his voice rough. The fascination did not pass. The years in Italy with Francesca were cordial but empty, and when she died, I mourned the waste of her young life and the child we had created. But I could not mourn the loss of a love that had never existed between us. And I have spent 15 years in Ext wondering about the choices I did not make, the conversations I did not have. The woman in the pale green dress who represented a path I lacked the courage to even consider. Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed to stand a few feet behind him, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, close enough that she could speak quietly and still be heard. Why tell me this now? Your Grace, she asked, what purpose does it serve to reveal feelings that are 20 years past their moment to unsettle the peace I have made with my life? He turned to face her, and she saw tears standing in his eyes, though they did not fall. Because I am 55 years old, Miss Ashworth, and I have learned that regret is a far heavier burden than risk. Because I could not leave London without knowing whether the woman I remembered still existed, or whether time had transformed you into someone I would not recognize. And because... He took a breath, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I needed to know whether I was alone in feeling that brief connection, or whether perhaps you felt it too, and have spent these years wondering, as I have, about what might have been. Eleanor looked into his grey eyes, and saw vulnerability and hope and fear all mingled together, and she felt something crack open in her chest, some protective shell she had built around her heart, to guard against exactly this kind of dangerous possibility. I felt it, she admitted, the words emerging before she could think better of them. When our eyes met that evening at the Montrose ball, I felt as though I had been seen for the first time in my life, truly seen, not as the disappointing daughter or the overlooked wallflower, but as myself. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds before someone called your name and you turned away, but I have carried those 5 seconds with me for 20 years like a talisman against the loneliness of being invisible. The Duke's hand reached out, hesitated, then gently took hers, his fingers warm and slightly trembling against her own. "We have both been fools, Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time and sending a shiver through her at the intimacy of it. "We have wasted 20 years in separate exiles when we might have—" He stopped, shaking his head. "But I will not compound my foolishness by presuming to know what you want or need now. I have settled my affairs in London more quickly than anticipated, and I am scheduled to return to Italy at month's end. Before I go, I simply wanted you to know that you were not invisible, not to me, and that the fault for my silence lay entirely in my own cowardice, not in any lack on your part." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, and one escaped to track down her cheek before she could stop it. "You have given me a gift I did not know I needed, Thomas," she said, emboldened by his use of her given name to reciprocate. "For 20 years I have believed myself fundamentally unworthy of notice, and you have just told me that the man I glimpsed across a ballroom, the man whose face I have remembered with impossible clarity, saw me in return. That knowledge changes something essential about how I understand my own history." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture formal yet somehow deeply intimate. "Then I am glad I found the courage to call upon you, even if it comes 2 decades too late." The maid appeared then with the tea service, breaking the spell of the moment, and they moved apart with the guilty quickness of people caught in an intimacy they have not yet earned the right to claim. They sat again, this time with the tea table between them, and attempted to navigate a more conventional conversation about London, about Italy, about the changes 20 years had wrought in both their lives. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her carefully ordered existence, felt the walls she had built around her heart developing cracks that let in dangerous light. And she knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her that Thomas Bancroft's return to London, his incomprehensible decision to seek her out, would change everything about the future she had resigned herself to living alone. The pattern established itself with surprising ease over the following fortnight, as Thomas called upon Eleanor every few days at the appointed hour of 3 o'clock, arriving with the punctuality of a man who valued her time and departing precisely 1 hour later to preserve her reputation, though both of them chafed against the artificial constraint of propriety when their conversations had barely begun to scratch the surface of all they wished to say. The second visit had been less awkward than the first, though still bounded by the formalities that governed interactions between a duke and an unmarried woman of modest means, and they had discussed Italian art with the careful politeness of near strangers who suspected they might become something more. The third visit had seen them debating the merits of various poets, Eleanor defending Wordsworth's romanticism, while Thomas argued for Byron's passionate cynicism, and she had felt a flutter of excitement at the way he listened to her opinions, as though they held genuine value rather than being merely the charming prattle expected of women. By the fourth visit, on a grey December afternoon when the light was already fading by 3:30 and the lamplighters were beginning their rounds in the street below, they had dispensed with much of the formality and settled into a rhythm of conversation that felt less like polite exchange and more like genuine communion between two minds that had been starved for exactly this kind of intellectual and emotional connection. Eleanor had prepared tea herself that afternoon, her single housemaid having been given the afternoon off to visit her ailing mother, and there was something pleasantly domestic about pouring for Thomas, handing him the cup and watching his long fingers curl around the delicate porcelain. They had been discussing philosophy, specifically the question of whether loneliness was a chosen state or an imposed condition. And Eleanor had argued passionately that society created categories of acceptable and unacceptable solitude, that a woman alone was pitied or scorned, while a man alone was respected for his independence. Thomas had countered that all loneliness, regardless of gender, carried the weight of paths not taken and connections not made, and that his 15 years in Italy had taught him that X could be as much internal as external, that one could be utterly alone in a crowded ballroom or find connection in perfect solitude if one's mind was engaged with ideas that transcended physical presence. The conversation had grown increasingly personal, the philosophical abstractions giving way to lived experience, and Eleanor found herself speaking with unusual candor about her debut season, about the humiliation of standing against the wall night after night, about the slow death of hope, as she realized that no gentleman would ever look past her plain face and serious demeanor to discover the person beneath. She spoke of her sister Catherine's effortless success, of watching her dance card fill within minutes while Eleanor's remained blank, of the well-meaning pity from matrons who suggested she might find fulfillment in charitable works since marriage seemed unlikely, of the gradual acceptance that she would live her life on the margins of society, observed but never truly seen. Thomas listened with an attention so complete it was almost painful, his grey eyes never leaving her face, and she saw something building in his expression, some emotion struggling against the constraints of propriety and caution. Finally, unable to bear the weight of all that remained unspoken between them, Eleanor set down her teacup and looked directly at him, gathering courage she had not known she possessed. "Thomas," she said, using his given name with the familiarity they had established over these visits, "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty, even if the truth is difficult. Why did you truly seek me out after all these years? You have spoken of remembering me from the Montrose ball, of being curious about what became of me, but there are hundreds of people from your past you might have inquired after, hundreds of connections you might have renewed. Why me? Why a woman you barely knew, a woman of no particular consequence, who can offer you nothing of value?" The Duke's composure, which had remained largely intact through their previous conversations, finally cracked. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension, and for a long moment he did not speak. Eleanor waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, afraid that she had pushed too far, that she had violated some unspoken boundary, and would now pay the price of his withdrawal. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. "Because I attended every ball you did during that season, Eleanor," he said, the words emerging as though torn from some deep place within him. "Not for the social obligations, not to fulfill my duties as an eligible duke, but because I found myself watching for you." He turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I would arrive at whatever ballroom or assembly was on the calendar that evening, and my eyes would scan the room until I found you, always in the same position, always near the edges, always half hidden, as though you wished to disappear entirely. And once I located you, I would position myself where I could observe you throughout the evening, stealing glances whenever I thought no one would notice, watching you read when you thought no one was looking, noting the way you occasionally smiled at something in your book, or the way your fingers would tap against your reticule in time with the music, even though you never danced." Eleanor felt her worldview tilting, everything she had believed about her invisible youth suddenly revealed as a lie, and she could not speak, could only stare at him as he continued. "I was engaged to Francesca," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the name. The contracts had been signed. The settlements agreed upon. My honor demanded that I maintain appropriate boundaries with all other women. But my heart, foolish and rebellious as it was, had fixed itself on you with an intensity that frightened me. I told myself it was merely the enchantment of what I could not have, the universal human tendency to want what is forbidden. I told myself that you were simply a fantasy I had constructed, that the real woman could not possibly be as compelling as the figure I observed from across crowded rooms. I told myself that once I left for Italy and began my life with Francesca, this inexplicable fascination would fade like morning mist. He crossed back to his chair and sank into it, his hands gripping the armrests as though he needed something solid to anchor him. But it did not fade, Eleanor. Not in Italy. Not during the 5 years of my marriage, not in the 15 years since Francesca's death. Do you know what haunted me in that villa in Venice, alone with my grief and guilt? It was not my wife's face I saw in my mind's eye, though I mourned her wasted youth and the child who never drew breath. It was your face the way you looked at the Cavendish ball in that ivory gown with the seed pearl trim, standing near the refreshment table and examining the flower arrangements as though they were works of art worthy of serious contemplation. It was your face at the Pemberton Musicale, when you closed your eyes during a particularly beautiful aria, and I saw such longing in your expression that I wanted to cross the room and ask what you were thinking, what dreams you harbored that the music called forth. Eleanor's hands had begun to tremble, and she gripped them together in her lap to still them. You are telling me that while I stood against the wall, believing myself beneath notice, invisible to everyone in the room, you were watching me, she said, and her voice emerged barely above a whisper. Every ball, every assembly, every musicale and garden party and literary evening, you were aware of my presence. He nodded, and now the tears did fall, tracking down his weathered cheeks without shame. Every moment I could manage without drawing attention, he confirmed. I remember every gown you wore, Eleanor, the pale green at Montrose, the ivory at Cavendish, the rose pink at the Hartley ball that made your complexion glow, despite what conventional beauty standards might say. I remember that you favored the left side of any ballroom because the light was better for reading. I remember that you would sometimes mouth the words to the music when a waltz was playing, as though you were dancing in your imagination even while your feet remained still. I remember the evening at Lady Worthington's when you laughed at something you read, a full, genuine laugh that you quickly stifled. And I wanted more than anything to know what had amused you, to share in that moment of joy. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her own face now, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that her entire understanding of her past had been built on a foundation of false assumptions. I thought no one saw me, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I was invisible, unworthy of attention, fundamentally undesirable. I built my entire life around that belief, constructed my sense of self around the knowledge that I was the woman no one chose, no one wanted, no one remembered. And now you are telling me that the man whose face I also remember with impossible clarity, the man I glimpsed across those same ballrooms and wondered about in the privacy of my thoughts, was watching me in return. She stood abruptly and crossed to where he sat, propriety forgotten in the rush of emotion. "Why did you never speak to me?" she demanded, and her voice carried 20 years of hurt and confusion. "If I meant something to you, if you felt this connection you describe, why did you let me believe I was invisible? Why did you leave for Italy without a word, without even a proper goodbye, without giving me the chance to know that someone, anyone, had seen me?" Thomas rose to meet her, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the gathering dusk, the room around them fading into shadow as the last of the afternoon light died beyond the windows. "I was a coward," he said simply. "I was engaged to another woman, bound by honor and family obligation, and the very real need to save my estates from financial ruin. Approaching you would have been a betrayal of Francesca, who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, and it would have complicated your life in ways that seemed unfair when I could offer you nothing but scandal. I told myself I was being noble by maintaining my distance, by allowing you to live your life undisturbed by my inconvenient feelings. But the truth is that I was simply afraid of what it might mean to acknowledge the depth of what I felt afraid of the choices I might be forced to make if I gave voice to emotions that had no acceptable outlet." His hand reached out, hesitated in the space between them, then gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I have carried the regret of my silence for 20 years, Eleanor," he said softly. "Every day in Italy, every evening I sat alone in that villa, watching the sun set over the lagoon. I wondered what might have happened if I had found the courage to break my engagement, to choose my heart over my duty, to offer you the chance to know me as I longed to know you. I told myself that such thinking was foolish, that I was romanticizing what had been merely a passing attraction, that you had probably married and forgotten me entirely. But when my steward's reports mentioned in passing that Miss Eleanor Ashworth of London remained unmarried, I began to wonder whether perhaps you too had carried something from that season, some fragment of recognition that had shaped the years that followed." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she found herself leaning into his touch, the warmth of his palm against her face sending shivers through her entire body. "I never married because no one ever asked," she admitted. "But the deeper truth is that no one ever asked because I never allowed anyone close enough to consider it. I compared every man I met to a memory, to a face I had glimpsed across a ballroom, to 5 seconds of eye contact that I convinced myself I had imagined or inflated into significance it never possessed. I thought I was preserving my dignity by accepting my solitary fate, but perhaps I was simply waiting, hoping that someday the man who had seemed to see me that one brief moment might return and confirm that I had not imagined the connection I felt." They stood thus in the darkening room, his hand still cupping her face, her eyes locked with his, and the sounds of London beyond the windows, the clip of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the call of vendors closing their stalls for the evening, the distant rumble of carriages, all faded into insignificance against the enormity of what was passing between them. Thomas's other hand rose to frame her face, and he looked at her with such intensity that she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical nakedness and everything to do with being truly seen, not as the overlooked wallflower or the resigned spinster, but as Eleanor, complete and whole and worthy of the devotion she saw reflected in his grey eyes. "When Francesca died," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I would never feel anything again beyond guilt and grief. I exiled myself to Italy not because I could not bear England, but because I could not bear the thought of returning to the ballrooms where I had first seen you, of walking streets where I might glimpse you and be forced to confront all the choices I had made that led me away from the life I truly wanted. But isolation and grief are poor companions, Eleanor, and they taught me that regret is a far heavier burden than risk. I am 55 years old, too old perhaps to believe in second chances, but I could not leave London without telling you the truth, without giving you the knowledge that you were never invisible, not to me, that every moment I stole to watch you across those ballrooms was a moment I treasured more than all the dances I shared with women whose names I cannot now remember." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, some tightly wound spring of loneliness and resignation that had been coiled there for decades, and she reached up to cover his hands with her own, holding them against her face as though she could anchor this moment, make it real and permanent, rather than allowing it to slip away like so many other possibilities in her life had slipped away. "I see you, Thomas," she whispered. "Just as you saw me then, I see you now. Not the duke or the title or the tragic figure returned from exile, but the man who remembered which side of the ballroom I preferred, who noticed when I laughed at something in my book, who carried the memory of a woman in a pale green dress for 20 years when he could have chosen to forget. That seeing, that being seen in return, is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and pressed his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "We have wasted so much time," he said, and she heard the ache of lost years in his voice. "I cannot give you back the dances you should have had, the courtship you deserved, the youth we might have shared if I had been braver." Eleanor's hands slid from his to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Then do not give me the past," she said firmly. "Give me the present. Give me the truth of what you feel now, not what you felt 20 years ago. Give me the possibility of a future I stopped allowing myself to imagine." His arms came around her then, pulling her close in an embrace that defied every rule of propriety, but felt more right than any socially sanctioned interaction Eleanor had ever experienced. And she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the solidity of him, the reality of his presence, after so many years of existing only in memory. They stood thus as full darkness fell beyond the windows, and the room around them dissolved into shadow. Two people who had spent 20 years in separate exiles finally finding their way back to the moment of recognition they had been too afraid to claim the first time. And Eleanor felt the walls of her modest drawing room contract around them as though the entire world had narrowed to just this space, this man, this miraculous second chance that neither of them had dared to hope for, but both had secretly longed for across all the years of loneliness and longing. They remained in that embrace for a long moment, the darkness deepening around them, until Eleanor finally stirred and stepped back reluctantly, suddenly aware that they had been standing pressed together in a manner that would scandalize anyone who might have witnessed it, though the privacy of her modest drawing room and the dismissal of her housemaid meant there were no witnesses to their impropriety. She moved to light the candles, her hands shaking slightly as she touched flame to wick, and the warm glow pushed back the shadow, revealing Thomas still standing where she had left him, his expression a mixture of wonder and something that looked like hope tempered by the painful knowledge of time lost. They settled back into their chairs, the intimacy of the moment not dissipated, but transformed into something that hummed between them like a living thing, and Eleanor found herself speaking without conscious thought, the words emerging from some deep place that had been locked away for decades. "I kept them, you know," she said quietly. "The dance cards from that season, every single one, blank as the day they were printed." Thomas's eyes sharpened with interest and something else, something that looked like pain. "You kept them," he repeated. "After all these years, you preserved evidence of that unhappy time." Eleanor nodded, rising from her chair with sudden decision, as though if she hesitated she might lose her nerve entirely. "Wait here," she said, and left the drawing room before he could respond, climbing the stairs to her bedroom, where the camphorwood box still sat on her writing desk from the night she had examined its contents after receiving his note. She carried the box back down carefully, as though it contained something fragile and precious rather than mere cardstock and faded memories. And when she re-entered the drawing room, Thomas stood immediately, his entire bearing shifting to one of heightened attention. She set the box on the small writing desk near the window and lifted the lid, withdrawing the 12 dance cards and spreading them across the surface like a card reader laying out a fortune, except these cards spoke only of absence and invisibility rather than destiny and fate. "These are my testament," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she arranged them. "My proof that I existed on the margins of society's glittering world, that I attended all the required events, wore all the appropriate gowns, learned all the proper steps, and still remained fundamentally unseen. I told Charlotte I kept them as a reminder that my worth is not determined by whether a gentleman signed a card, but the truth is more complicated." She paused, looking down at the pristine ivory rectangles with their elegant gold filigree borders and empty lines. "I kept them because they are the most honest record of who I was during that season. More honest than any journal entry or letter home. They do not lie or embellish or soften the reality. They simply exist in their blankness. A perfect representation of how I moved through those months, present but unacknowledged, visible but unseen." Thomas approached the desk slowly, as though the cards might vanish if he moved too quickly, and when he reached Eleanor's side, he looked down at them with an expression of such profound sorrow that she had to resist the urge to gather them up and hide them away, to spare him whatever pain they caused. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing to the cards, and when she nodded, he picked up the first one with hands that trembled noticeably. "The Montrose Ball," he read aloud, his voice rough. "May 12th, 1838. He studied the card for a long moment, his thumb tracing the empty lines where names should have been inscribed, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I remember this evening," he said softly. "You wore the pale green dress, and you were reading Paradise Lost behind the potted palm. I wanted to approach you, to ask if you preferred Milton's Satan or his God, whether you found the fallen angel sympathetic or irredeemable. But I had just announced my engagement that very afternoon, and I stood across the ballroom watching you and hating myself for my cowardice." He set down the first card and picked up the second, the Cavendish ball, and his expression shifted to something even more pained. "April 28th, 1838, he read. "You wore ivory silk with seed pearls at the neckline and hem. I remember thinking you looked like moonlight given human form, cool and luminous and utterly out of place among the gaudy colors the other young ladies favored. You stood near the refreshment table for most of the evening, and I watched you examine the flower arrangements as though they were works of art in a museum, your face completely absorbed in studying the way the roses had been arranged with ferns and baby's breath." Eleanor stared at him, unable to comprehend how he could recall such specific details from events that had occurred 2 decades ago, events she herself remembered only in broad strokes of humiliation and loneliness. "How can you possibly remember what I wore?" she whispered. "I barely remember myself, and I was the one wearing the gowns." Thomas set down the second card and looked at her with eyes that held 20 years of regret. "Because I committed every detail to memory, Eleanor. Because those stolen glances were all I allowed myself, and so I hoarded them like a miser hoards gold, examining each memory over and over during the years that followed." He picked up another card, then another, working through the stack methodically. The Pemberton Musicale, the Hartley Ball, the Worthington Garden Party, the Assembly at Almack's. For each one, he recited the date, described what she had worn, recalled where she had positioned herself, noted what she had been doing. The accuracy of his recollections was almost frightening in its precision, as though he had been keeping a detailed journal of her movements, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed understanding of that season crumbling entirely, replaced by this alternate history where she had been the object of devoted attention from the one man whose regard she had secretly craved. When he had examined all 12 cards, he set them down in a neat row across her writing desk and stood looking at them in silence, his jaw tight with emotion. "May I ask you something?" he said finally, and Eleanor nodded, though she felt almost afraid of what he might request. "These cards, they represent dances that should have been claimed, partners who should have signed them, a season that should have been filled with the normal pleasures of a young woman's debut." He turned to face her fully. "If I could go back, if I could aunt my cowardice and my silence, I would sign every single one of these cards. I would claim every dance, every waltz and quadrille and country reel, every moment you spent standing alone against the wall. Since I cannot change the past, would you permit me to at least acknowledge what should have been, to fill these empty lines with the name that should have been there from the beginning?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she could not speak, could only stare at him as the full implication of his request settled over her. "You want to sign them now?" she managed finally. 20 years later, you want to retroactively claim dances that were never offered, never accepted, never danced." He nodded slowly, his hand reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing a fountain pen, the elegant instrument clearly expensive and well-maintained. "I know it is merely symbolic," he said quietly. "I know it cannot erase the pain of that season or give you back the youth you spent believing yourself invisible. But I need you to know, to have tangible proof, that these cards should never have been empty, that the fault lies entirely with me and not with any lack on your part. Will you let me correct this record, inadequate as the gesture may be?" Eleanor looked at the blank cards spread before her, at the empty lines that had remained unfilled for 2 decades, and felt tears begin to stream down her face, though she made no move to wipe them away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas, you may sign them." His hands were steadier than hers as he picked up the first card, the one from the Montrose ball where they had first glimpsed each other across a crowded room, and he uncapped his fountain pen with deliberate care. The scratch of nib against aged paper seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room, and Eleanor watched transfixed as he wrote in a bold, masculine hand across the first line, "Thomas Bancroft, Duke of Ashford." The ink was deep black against the ivory cardstock, and the letters were perfectly formed despite the slight tremble in his fingers. He moved to the second line and signed again, the same name repeated with the same careful precision. Line by line, he filled the first card, his signature claiming every dance that had been listed, from the opening quadrille to the final waltz, and when he finished, he set it aside and picked up the next card. "The Cavendish Ball," he said softly, as though narrating his actions helped make them real. "April 28th, 1838. You wore ivory silk with seed pearls. I would have asked for the supper waltz, Eleanor, the one that would have given me the excuse to escort you to dinner, to sit beside you for an hour and discover what made you laugh, what subjects captured your imagination, whether you thought about the books you read long after closing their covers." His pen moved across the lines, signing, always signing, and Eleanor sank into her chair, her eyes never leaving his hands as they worked. The third card, the fourth, each one accompanied by his quiet recitation of the date, and what she had worn, and which dances he would have claimed if he had possessed the courage. "The Pemberton Musicale, May 3rd, 1838. You wore rose pink and closed your eyes during the aria from Don Giovanni, and I would have asked for every dance they offered afterward, just to see if I could make you smile. The Hartley Ball, May 19th, you wore lavender with white ribbons, and I would have asked for the opening waltz and the closing reel and every dance in between." His voice began to break as he continued, the emotion he had been holding in check finally overwhelming his composure and Eleanor saw tears sliding down his cheeks even as his hand remained steady, signing each line with the same careful deliberation. The Worthington Garden Party, June 2nd. You wore pale yellow and carried a book in your reticule that you read while pretending to admire the roses, and I would have asked you to walk with me through the gardens, away from the crowds, where we might have spoken freely without the weight of propriety crushing every honest impulse. The Huntington Masquerade, June 15th. You were disguised as Athena with a golden helmet and a gown of white and gold. And I knew you immediately despite the mask, because I would have recognized the way you stood anywhere, the slight tilt of your head when you were observing rather than participating, and I would have asked for the quadrille and the final waltz, the dances that would have bracketed the evening and marked me as your chosen partner. Eleanor could not stop crying now, the tears flowing freely as she watched him work his way through the remaining cards, each signature an apology, a confession, a declaration of what should have been. She reached out and touched one of the completed cards, her finger tracing his signature, feeling the slight dampness of the ink that had not yet fully dried, making it real, making it permanent, making it true. "You are rewriting my history," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You are taking the story I have told myself for 20 years and changing its fundamental narrative." He paused in his signing to look at her, his own face wet with tears, his grey eyes blazing with intensity. "I am correcting it, Eleanor," he said firmly. "These cards should never have been empty. The fault was mine, not yours, and I need you to understand that with absolute clarity. You were not overlooked because you lacked worth or beauty or charm. You were overlooked because I was too much a coward to claim what my heart recognized from the first moment I saw you, and because other men were too blind to see what was plainly before them." He returned to his task, working through the final cards with the same methodical care he had brought to the first ones. The assembly at Almack's, the Montrose Musicale, the final ball of the season at the Cavendish House in late June. For each one, he recited what she had worn, where she had positioned herself, what he had wished he could say to her, and with each recitation, Eleanor felt the edifice of her self-perception shifting, the narrative of invisibility and unworthiness crumbling to reveal something underneath that she had been too afraid to acknowledge. When he signed the final line of the final card, he set down his pen and gathered all 12 cards together, holding them carefully as though they were sacred texts rather than mere social ephemera. "The box that held absence," he said quietly, "now holds presence. The record of your invisibility has become a testament to how deeply you were seen, even if I lacked the courage to let you know it." He handed the cards back to her, and she took them with trembling hands, looking down at line after line of his signature, his name repeated over and over like a mantra or a prayer. Thomas Bancroft, Duke of Ashford, claiming every dance, every moment, every opportunity he had let slip away through cowardice and misplaced honor. The cards felt heavier now, weighted with meaning and intention, and she spread them across her lap, touching each signature as though she could absorb through her fingertips the devotion they represented. "This is the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done for me," she said, her voice barely audible. "You have given me proof that I was seen, that I mattered, that those months of loneliness and hurt were not the complete story I believed them to be. You have taken my evidence of invisibility and transformed it into a record of hidden devotion." Thomas knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and took her hands in his, the signed cards pressed between their palms. "I would give you more if I could," he said urgently. I would give you back every moment of youth I stole from you through my silence. I would give you the courtship you deserved, the dances we should have shared, the conversations that might have changed both our lives. Since I cannot alter the past, I can only offer you this inadequate amendment and hope that you understand what it represents." Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of regret and longing and something else, something that looked remarkably like hope, and she felt the last of her defenses crumble. "I understand," she said softly. "I understand that you have just given me the most precious gift imaginable, not because these signatures change what happened, but because they change how I understand what happened. They transform my story from one of rejection to one of connection, thwarted by circumstance, from unwanted to secretly cherished." They sat thus in the candle-lit room, hands clasped with the signed dance cards between them, and the sounds of London beyond the windows faded to nothing, against the enormity of what had just transpired. The box that had held her treasured emptiness for 20 years now overflowed with presents, with Thomas's bold signatures filling every space that should have been filled 2 decades ago, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself, in her acceptance of a past that had shaped her, but need not define her future. The scratch of his pen on aged paper echoed in her memory like the sound of healing, of amendment, of a wrong acknowledged and symbolically, if not practically, corrected, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would keep these cards for the rest of her life, not as evidence of invisibility, but as proof that she had been seen, treasured, remembered across 20 years by a man who had lacked the courage to claim her then, but who had finally found the strength to confess his devotion now. The morning after Thomas signed the dance cards, Eleanor woke with a sense of possibility she had not felt in decades. The signed cards carefully arranged in their box on her writing desk, where she could see them upon opening her eyes. Tangible proof that the previous evening had not been a dream born of loneliness and longing. She had slept poorly, her mind too active with the enormity of what had transpired, with Thomas's confession and his methodical claiming of every dance she had been denied, and when she finally did drift into fitful sleep, she dreamed of ballrooms where she waltzed in his arms while the world watched and approved. The morning light streaming through her bedroom window was harsh and unforgiving, in the way December sunlight often is, revealing every shabby corner of her modest room, every mended curtain and faded coverlet. But Eleanor found she did not care about the poverty of her circumstances in quite the same way she had before, because Thomas had seen her in this very house and declared her worthy of his devotion regardless of her material situation. She dressed with more care than usual, choosing a day dress of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and she arranged her hair with particular attention, allowing a few tendrils to escape the severe style she typically favored, softening her appearance in a way she would have once dismissed as foolish vanity, but which now felt like a reasonable acknowledgement that someone might actually look at her and find pleasure in what he saw. Charlotte was already at breakfast when Eleanor descended, and the girl's face lit up with curiosity the moment her aunt entered the small dining room. "Aunt Eleanor," she said eagerly, "you look different this morning. Did something happen during the Duke's visit yesterday?" Before Eleanor could formulate a response that would satisfy her niece's curiosity without revealing too much, they heard the sound of an arrival at the front door, the imperious knock that suggested someone of consequence who expected immediate admittance. Eleanor's housemaid appeared moments later, her face flushed and anxious. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ashworth, but Lady Hartwell has arrived and insists on seeing you immediately. She said it is a matter of utmost urgency and will not be delayed." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, because her sister Catherine never called at this hour unless something had upset her considerably, and the timing suggested that the matter of urgency involved Thomas's visits. "Show her in," Eleanor said quietly, setting down her teacup with a hand that trembled slightly, and Charlotte's eyes widened with alarm, clearly sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Catherine swept into the dining room like a force of nature, her beauty still remarkable even at 36, despite the lines that unhappiness had begun to etch around her mouth and eyes. She wore a morning dress of emerald silk that must have cost more than Eleanor spent on clothing in a year, and her golden hair was arranged in the latest fashion, secured with combs set with what appeared to be genuine emeralds. She had maintained the physical advantages that had made her the toast of her season, but there was a hardness in her expression now, a bitterness that came from a decade of marriage to Lord Hartwell, a man who appreciated his wife's beauty, but cared nothing for her thoughts or feelings. "Catherine," Eleanor said, rising from her chair with as much composure as she could muster, "this is an unexpected visit. Will you join us for breakfast?" Her sister dismissed the offer with a wave of her gloved hand. "I have not come for pleasantries, Eleanor. Charlotte, leave us. This is a private matter between sisters." Charlotte looked to Eleanor for guidance, clearly reluctant to abandon her aunt to whatever storm Catherine had brought with her, but Eleanor nodded gently. "It is all right, dear. Your mother and I need to speak alone." Once Charlotte had departed, closing the door behind her with obvious reluctance, Catherine turned on Eleanor with an expression that combined fury, bewilderment, and something that looked remarkably like jealousy. "Is it true?" she demanded without preamble. "The entire city is buzzing with the news that the Duke of Ashford has been calling upon you, visiting your home multiple times over the past fortnight. Lady Pemberton mentioned it to Mrs. Whitmore, who told Lady Hertford, who made certain to inform me at yesterday's afternoon tea with such obvious relish that I wanted to throw my teacup at her smug face. Tell me it is mere gossip, Eleanor. Tell me you have not been so foolish as to entertain the attentions of a duke when you must know how such a thing will appear." Eleanor moved to the window, needing the distance and the light to steady herself for what she knew would be a difficult confrontation. "It is true," she said quietly. "The Duke of Ashford has been calling upon me. We have been renewing an acquaintance from many years ago, discussing literature and art and other matters of mutual interest. I fail to see why this should concern you or anyone else." Catherine's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You fail to see why it concerns me that my spinster sister is making herself the subject of every gossip in London. Eleanor, you are 38 years old, plain, poor, and utterly without the advantages that might make such attentions credible. Do you not see how this appears? The Duke of Ashford could have any woman in London, any beautiful young thing with a fortune and connections, yet he chooses to visit you in your shabby little townhouse. People are saying he has lost his wits in Italy, that grief has made him eccentric, that he must be toying with you for some incomprehensible reason." Eleanor turned to face her sister, feeling anger begin to burn through the numbness that Catherine's cruelty typically induced. "And what do you think, Catherine? Do you believe Thomas is toying with me, that his visits are some sort of cruel joke at my expense?" The use of the Duke's given name made Catherine's eyes widen with shock. "Thomas," she repeated incredulously, "you presume to call a duke by his Christian name? My God, Eleanor, you are even more deluded than I feared. What has he told you to make you believe this is anything more than the whim of a lonely widower who will return to Italy the moment he tires of whatever peculiar fancy has fixed on you?" Eleanor felt something harden in her chest, a core of strength that she had discovered during Thomas's confession, and which now served as armor against her sister's attack. "He has told me that he remembers me from my debut season," she said evenly. "He has told me that he watched me at every ball and assembly we both attended, that he noticed details about me that I believed no one ever saw, that he has carried the memory of me for 20 years, despite being married to another woman and living in exile abroad. He has told me that his greatest regret is not having the courage to approach me then." and he has come to London now in part to let me know that I was never invisible, never unworthy, never the overlooked failure that I believed myself to be." Catherine stared at her sister as though she were speaking a foreign language. "That is impossible," she said flatly. "No man, especially not a duke, carries the memory of a wallflower for 20 years. You are imagining significance where none exists, reading meaning into polite conversation, mistaking casual kindness for genuine regard. Eleanor, I say this because I care for you, because I am your sister, and I do not wish to see you hurt. Whatever you think is happening between you and the Duke, it cannot end well. Dukes do not marry spinsters, particularly not spinsters who are approaching 40 with no fortune, no beauty, and no connections beyond a family name that has seen better days." The words struck like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to push Eleanor back into the small space Catherine had always expected her to occupy. But instead of retreating, instead of accepting the judgment as she had done for decades, Eleanor felt the strength Thomas had given her, rising like a tide. "Perhaps not," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Perhaps dukes do not marry spinsters, and perhaps whatever is developing between Thomas and myself will end in disappointment. But this duke remembers me when no one else did, Catherine. This duke sees value in me that you and the rest of society have always overlooked, and that alone, regardless of how this situation resolves, is worth whatever gossip or judgment comes my way." Catherine's face flushed with anger, and Eleanor saw something ugly flash in her sister's eyes, something that had perhaps always been there, but which Eleanor had been too accommodating to acknowledge. "You were always the odd one," Catherine said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Always preferring books to balls, ideas to dancing, solitude to society. You cannot blame the world for treating you as you presented yourself, Eleanor. You chose to stand against the wall rather than making yourself agreeable. You chose to bring books to ballrooms instead of engaging in the flirtation and conversation that might have attracted gentlemen's notice. You made yourself invisible through your own actions, and now you want to blame society for your choices." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt 20 years of suppressed resentment suddenly boiling to the surface. All the hurt and anger she had swallowed in the name of family harmony. All the times she had made herself smaller to accommodate Catherine's need to be the beautiful one, the successful one, the sister who mattered. "I can and do blame a world that values only surface beauty," Eleanor said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "I can and do blame a society that demands women package themselves as decorative objects rather than thinking beings. You speak of choices, Catherine, as though I chose to be plain, chose to be overlooked, chose to spend my youth watching you dance while I stood alone. I did not choose any of that. What I chose was to maintain my dignity, to refuse to simper and flatter, and pretend to be less intelligent than I am in order to make men comfortable. What I chose was honesty over performance, substance over spectacle. And if that made me invisible to the world, then the fault lies with a world that cannot see past a pretty face to the person beneath." Catherine's expression hardened, and Eleanor saw genuine fury there now, the rage of a woman who had built her entire identity on being the beautiful sister, the desired one, the success story, and who could not tolerate the suggestion that her advantages might be shallow or unearned. "You are fooling yourself if you think the Duke sees anything in you beyond a momentary curiosity," she hissed. "Men like him do not fall in love with women like you, Eleanor. They marry beautiful women with fortunes, and they take plain women as companions or governesses or charity cases. If the Duke is paying you attention now, it is because he is bored, because he is lonely, because he wants the novelty of a blue stocking to pass the time before he returns to his real life in Italy. And when he leaves, as he inevitably will, you will be left here with nothing but your broken heart and the mockery of everyone who watched you make a fool of yourself. Eleanor crossed to her writing desk where the box of signed dance cards sat, and she lifted the lid, withdrawing one of the cards and holding it so Catherine could see the lines filled with Thomas's bold signature. "He signed my dance cards," she said quietly. "Every single one from my debut season, every line that should have been filled 20 years ago but remained empty because no one asked me to dance. Thomas asked my permission to retroactively claim every waltz, every quadrille, every reel and country dance that I spent standing alone against the wall. He remembered what I wore to each ball, where I positioned myself, what I was reading when I thought no one was watching. And he signed these cards not because he pities me or because he is amusing himself at my expense, but because he wanted me to know that I was seen, that I mattered, that the emptiness of my youth was not a reflection of my worth, but a failure of courage on his part." Catherine's eyes fixed on the card, and Eleanor saw confusion and disbelief warring with something darker, something that looked like envy. "That is absurd," Catherine said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Signing old dance cards, claiming dances that never happened. It is a meaningless gesture, Eleanor, a romantic fantasy that changes nothing about the reality of your situation." Eleanor placed the card carefully back in the box and closed the lid, her movements deliberate and calm. "It changes everything about how I understand my situation," she said firmly. "It transforms my narrative from rejected to secretly cherished, from invisible to observed with devotion I never knew existed. You may call it a meaningless gesture, but to me it is validation of every instinct I had that there was more to my story than the one society told me. And I no longer need your approval, Catherine, or society's approval, or anyone's approval beyond my own and Thomas's. For the first time in my life, someone sees my value, and I will not apologize for accepting that gift or for allowing myself to believe I might deserve it." The two sisters faced each other across the small dining room, years of accumulated hurt and resentment crackling in the air between them. And Eleanor saw her sister, truly for perhaps the first time, saw past the beauty to the unhappiness beneath, the bitterness of a woman who had gotten everything she was supposed to want and found it hollow. "You are making a mistake," Catherine said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "And when this ends badly, as it surely will, do not come to me for sympathy. I warned you, Eleanor. I tried to protect you from your own foolishness." Eleanor met her sister's gaze steadily, unflinching. "Then I will make my mistake with my eyes open," she said quietly. "I have spent 38 years protecting myself from disappointment by never allowing myself to hope for more than society deemed appropriate for a woman like me. I am done with that, Catherine. I am done making myself small to fit into the space others have assigned me. If Thomas's regard leads to heartbreak, then I will survive it as I have survived every other disappointment in my life. But I will not turn away from the possibility of happiness simply because you or anyone else thinks I do not deserve it." Catherine's face hardened into the imperious mask she wore in society, all vulnerability hidden behind aristocratic disdain. "Very well," she said coldly. "Play out this farce if you must. But when the Duke returns to Italy without you, when the gossip turns truly vicious, when you are left with nothing but your signed dance cards and your broken dreams, remember that I tried to save you from yourself." She swept toward the door with the same dramatic flair with which she had entered, but paused at the threshold to deliver one final blow. You know what the crueler ladies are saying, Eleanor. They are saying that the Duke of Ashford must be mad or desperate to pay court to the Ashworth spinster. They are placing wagers on how long his peculiar fancy will last before he comes to his senses. You may choose to ignore society's judgment, but you cannot escape it entirely. And when it crushes you, as it surely will, you will wish you had listened to those who tried to spare you the pain. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with finality, and Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Charlotte appeared moments later, clearly having been listening from the hallway, and she rushed to her aunt's side with tears streaming down her face. "Aunt Eleanor," she said urgently, "you must not listen to her. Mamma is cruel and bitter because her own marriage brought her no happiness, and she cannot bear to see you find what she never had. You were magnificent, standing up to her like that. I have never heard you speak to her so forcefully." Eleanor pulled her niece into an embrace, taking comfort in the girl's fierce loyalty, even as she felt the weight of Catherine's words settling over her like a shroud. Charlotte was right that her sister spoke from bitterness and jealousy, but that did not make her warnings entirely wrong. The gossip was undoubtedly as vicious as Catherine suggested, the mockery as sharp, the judgment as cruel. And Thomas would be leaving for Italy at month's end, just as he had always planned, and Eleanor would be left here in London to face whatever social consequences came from having entertained the attentions of a duke. But as she held her niece and looked across the room at the box containing her signed dance cards, she found that she did not regret standing her ground, did not regret claiming her right to be seen and valued, did not regret refusing to shrink back into the invisibility that had defined her for so long. Catherine represented the voice of convention and cruelty that Eleanor had internalized for decades. The constant refrain that she was less than, unworthy, foolish to hope for more than society decreed appropriate for a plain spinster with no fortune. But Thomas's confession had cracked open that old narrative, and his signing of the dance cards had provided Eleanor with a different story, one where she had been treasured all along, where her invisibility had been imposed rather than inherent, where her worth had simply been waiting for someone with eyes clear enough to see it. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, harsh and revealing, illuminating all the ways Eleanor's modest home fell short of where a duke should call, all the ways her appearance and circumstances marked her as unsuitable for the regard she had received. But it also illuminated the box on her desk, the tangible proof that Thomas had filled the emptiness of her past with his belated declaration, and Eleanor knew that whatever came next, whatever judgment society leveled or pain she might endure, she would not relinquish this new understanding of herself, this knowledge that she had been seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered more to her than all of London's gossip combined. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day in a state of agitation. She could not entirely calm, Catherine's warnings echoing in her mind despite her best efforts to dismiss them, and by the time evening fell and the lamplighters made their rounds on Clarges Street, she had worked herself into such a state of anxiety that she jumped at every sound, convinced that each creak of the house settling or gust of wind against the windows was Thomas arriving to tell her that the gossip had become too damaging, that he could not, in good conscience, continue to call upon her and subject her to society's cruelty. She had dismissed Charlotte to bed early, unable to bear the girl's concerned glances and attempts at cheerful conversation, and she sat alone in her drawing-room with only a single lamp burning and the fire dying in the grate, too restless to read or engage in any productive activity, simply waiting for whatever blow would fall next. When the knock came at her door well past the hour when respectable callers should be received, Eleanor's heart lurched with a mixture of dread and relief, and she heard her housemaid's uncertain voice in the hall, followed by the deeper tones she had come to recognize instantly. She rose quickly, smoothing her dress with nervous hands, and when Thomas entered the drawing room, she saw immediately that something was wrong. His face was drawn with distress, his usual composure fractured, and he carried himself with the tension of a man barely maintaining control over powerful emotions. "Eleanor," he said without preamble, his voice rough and urgent, "I have heard about your sister's visit this morning. Lady Pemberton felt it her duty to inform me of the gossip that is spreading through every drawing room in London. And I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "I am so profoundly sorry. I never intended to damage your reputation or make you the subject of cruel speculation. I was selfish in seeking you out, thoughtless in not considering how my attentions would appear to a society that judges women far more harshly than men." Eleanor gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, pacing the small confines of her drawing room like a caged animal. "Please, Thomas," she said quietly, "sit down and tell me what has upset you so terribly." He finally sank into his accustomed chair, but his body remained tense, his hands gripping the armrests as though he needed something solid to anchor him. "Lady Pemberton told me that your sister called upon you in a fury, that she accused you of making yourself a laughingstock, that the gossip has turned vicious in its speculation about why a duke would pay court to a woman of your circumstances," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "She told me that wagers are being placed on how long my interest will last, that ladies are saying I must have lost my wits in Italy, that you are being mocked and pitied in equal measure. Eleanor, I cannot bear knowing that I have brought this upon you. I came to London to settle my affairs and return to Italy, and I should have left well enough alone, should have carried my memories in silence, rather than seeking you out and disrupting the peace you had made with your life." Eleanor felt something fierce rise in her chest, an anger not at Thomas, but at the society that forced them into this conversation, that made genuine connection between two people a matter for gossip and cruel speculation. She crossed to where he sat and stood before him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Are you offering to cease your visits?" she asked directly. "Are you telling me that because society disapproves, because my sister is cruel, because people are placing wagers, you intend to walk away and return to Italy as though these past weeks never happened?" Thomas looked up at her with such anguish that she felt it like a physical pain. "I am offering to release you from this connection," he said hoarsely. "I am giving you the opportunity to end this before the damage to your reputation becomes irreparable. I am trying, however inadequately, to protect you from the consequences of my selfishness." Eleanor surprised herself with the vehemence of her response. "No," she said firmly. "No, Thomas, I will not be released. I will not allow you to make this decision for me, as though I am incapable of weighing the costs and benefits of our association. I am 38 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life being careful, being cautious, protecting my small corner of respectability because it was all I had. But you have shown me that I was never as invisible as I believed, that there was someone who saw me and valued me all along. And I will not give that up simply because society finds it incomprehensible that a duke might prefer substance over beauty or age over youth." Her words seemed to break something open in him, and he covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with emotion he could no longer contain. "You do not understand," he said, his voice muffled and broken. "You do not know what you are accepting by refusing to release me. You do not know the full measure of my failures, my guilt, my unworthiness of the regard you are offering me." Eleanor knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his level, and gently pulled his hands away from his face, holding them in her own despite the breach of propriety such intimacy represented. "Then tell me," she said softly. "Tell me everything you think disqualifies you from happiness, and let me decide for myself whether those things matter as much as you believe they do." He looked at her with eyes red-rimmed from suppressed tears, and she saw vulnerability so raw it made her ache. "I married Francesca Morelli in the summer of 1838, he began, his voice steady now, but hollow, as though he were reciting facts about someone else's life rather than his own. "The marriage contract was negotiated by our respective families, the financial arrangements made to save the Ashford estates from bankruptcy that my uncle's profligacy had brought to the brink of ruin. Francesca was 19 years old, beautiful in the way Italian women often are, with dark hair and dark eyes and a grace that came from being raised among Venice's merchant aristocracy. She was accomplished in all the appropriate ways, could sing and play the pianoforte, spoke 3 languages fluently, understood the social obligations of a duchess. By every objective measure, she was exactly the wife a duke should want." He paused, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "But we shared no affection, Eleanor. No genuine connection beyond the cordial partnership expected of an arranged marriage. We were polite to one another. We fulfilled our respective duties. We maintained the appearance of harmony that society required. But we did not love each other. I tried. God knows I tried to feel for her what a husband should feel for his wife. But every time I looked at her, I felt only the weight of obligation and the ghost of what I had given up by not having the courage to break the engagement and pursue the woman I actually wanted." Eleanor's breath caught at the implication of his words, but she did not interrupt, sensing that he needed to tell this story in its entirety, to excavate the guilt and grief he had carried alone for so many years. "Francesca became pregnant in our 3rd year of marriage," he continued, his voice growing rougher. "She was terrified of childbirth, had heard too many stories of women who died in labor, and her fear infected our household, turned what should have been a joyful anticipation into something dark and ominous. I tried to comfort her, to assure her that she would survive, that we would have the best physicians and midwives, but my words rang hollow because I could not offer her the one thing that might have eased her terror, which was the certainty that she was deeply loved, that I would have given anything to spare her pain." He stopped, and Eleanor saw tears begin to track down his face. "She died in childbirth, along with our son, when I was 32 years old. The labor went on for 2 days, and there was nothing the physicians could do except watch her suffer and eventually slip away. I held her hand at the end, and her last words to me were an apology for failing to give me an heir. She died believing she had disappointed me, Eleanor, died thinking of duty and obligation rather than love, and I could not tell her anything different, because the truth would have been even crueler than the lie. The guilt and grief sent me into exile, because I could not bear to remain in England, could not bear to face the society that had facilitated a marriage built on financial necessity, rather than genuine feeling. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her own face now, but she held his hands firmly, grounding him with her touch. "You carry guilt for circumstances that were not entirely within your control," she said gently. "You were young, bound by family obligation and financial necessity. You tried to honor your commitment to Francesca even when your heart was engaged elsewhere. That is not failure, Thomas. That is attempting to do right in an impossible situation." He shook his head vehemently. "But it was not love that drove my sorrow, Eleanor. That is what I have never been able to forgive myself for. I mourned Francesca and our son, yes, but what I grieved was the waste of it all. 2 lives spent in obligation rather than joy, a marriage that satisfied society's requirements but left both parties fundamentally alone. I grieved for the woman I barely knew who died believing herself inadequate, and I grieved for the child who never drew breath, but I could not grieve the loss of a love that had never existed. And in the midst of that grief, during those first terrible months in Venice when I could barely function, do you know whose face I saw in my mind? Do you know who I thought of when I allowed myself to imagine what life might have been if I had chosen differently? Eleanor's voice emerged as barely a whisper. Mine. He nodded, fresh tears falling. Yours. Always yours. The woman in the pale green dress who read Paradise Lost at ballrooms, who stood apart from the spectacle and seemed to exist in a world of her own. I spent 15 years in Italy wondering what might have happened if I had found the courage to break my engagement and pursue you, if I had valued my own happiness over family obligation, if I had been brave enough to choose connection over duty. I told myself I was being morbid, that I was romanticizing a woman I barely knew, that the real Eleanor Ashworth could never live up to the ideal I had constructed. But the wondering never stopped, and the regret grew heavier with each passing year until it became a second shadow I carried everywhere. Eleanor released one of his hands to touch his face, turning his head so he had to look at her directly. And now, she said softly, now that you have found me again, now that you know I am real and not an idealized memory, now that you have told me all of this, what do you want, Thomas? What are you asking of me? His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. I have nothing to offer you, Eleanor, he said desperately. I am 55 years old. My estate is still burdened with debts that will take years to fully resolve. And I carry grief like a second shadow that colors everything I see and feel. I am broken by the choices I made and the years I wasted, and I have no right to ask you to take on the burden of a man so damaged by his own history. You deserve someone whole, someone capable of offering you the kind of uncomplicated happiness that I will never be able to provide. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a clarity emerging from the tangle of emotion and uncertainty. And I am 38 years old, plain, poor, and have no prospects, she said firmly. By society's measure, we are both disqualified from happiness, both too old and too damaged and too burdened by our respective histories to deserve a second chance. Perhaps that frees us to seek it anyway, Thomas. Perhaps being broken in similar ways makes us better suited to understanding each other's scars. His eyes searched her face as though looking for certainty he could trust. I thought signing those dance cards would bring closure, he admitted. I thought acknowledging what should have been would allow me to let go of the past and return to Italy with some measure of peace. But instead, it has awakened longing. I thought long dead, Eleanor. Instead, it has made me want things I have no right to want, a future I am too old and too damaged to claim. Eleanor took both his hands again and held them firmly. Then perhaps we are both done with closure and ready for beginning, she said quietly. Perhaps we have spent enough years in exile from the lives we might have lived, and perhaps it is time to choose courage over caution, even if the world thinks we are foolish. Perhaps being damaged by time and circumstance does not disqualify us from happiness, but rather gives us the wisdom to recognize it when it appears. Thomas pulled her hands to his lips and pressed kisses to her knuckles, his tears falling on her skin. I do not know how to do this, he confessed. I do not know how to build something new from the ruins of so many wasted years. I do not know if I am capable of offering you anything beyond the broken pieces of a man who has lived too long with regret as his primary companion. Eleanor rose and drew him to his feet, and they stood facing each other in the dimly lit room, the fire having burned down to embers that cast more shadow than light. Then we will learn together, she said. We will build something from our broken pieces and see if they fit together in a way that makes us both more whole than we were apart. We will choose courage this time, instead of repeating the patterns that stole our youth. And if society disapproves, if the gossip grows crueler, if people place wagers on our failure, then we will let them, because their judgment means nothing compared to the possibility of finally living according to our own hearts rather than their expectations. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and longing, and Eleanor pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. The room around them had grown dark except for the dying embers in the grate, and beyond the windows London continued its indifferent bustle. Carriages rattling past and voices calling in the street, but inside her modest drawing-room they had created their own world, a space where two damaged people could acknowledge their brokenness and choose each other anyway. "I will not leave for Italy at month's end," Thomas said into her hair. "I will stay in London and face whatever consequences come from choosing you over propriety. I will endure the gossip and the speculation and the judgment, because the alternative, which is losing you again after finally finding the courage to claim what my heart recognized 20 years ago, is unthinkable." Eleanor lifted her face to look at him, and in the dim light she saw not the polished duke or the grief-haunted widower, but simply Thomas, a man as scarred and uncertain as she was. A man who had spent half his life wondering what might have been, and who was finally willing to discover what might yet be. "We are both fools," she said softly, but there was no censure in her voice, only wonder. Fools who have wasted 20 years, and who should know better than to believe that happiness is possible at our age, with our histories, given everything stacked against us. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Then let us be fools together," he said. "Let us be foolish enough to believe that it is never too late for courage, never too late for honesty, never too late for love." And Eleanor, looking into his grey eyes and seeing reflected there the same longing and hope and fear that she felt herself, knew that whatever came next, whatever trials they would face or judgment they would endure, she had already made her choice, had already decided that the possibility of happiness with this man who had watched her from across ballrooms 20 years ago was worth any price society might demand. Lady Pemberton's annual winter ball was the event of the London season, held each year in mid-December in her magnificent townhouse in Mayfair, and the invitation that arrived at Eleanor's modest home 3 days after Thomas's confession carried with it both a lifeline and a challenge. The note accompanying the formal invitation was written in Lady Pemberton's distinctive hand and left no room for equivocation. "My dear Eleanor, you will attend my ball on Friday evening, and you will hold your head high despite whatever gossip the small-minded choose to spread. I have taken the liberty of informing the Duke of Ashford that I expect him to be present as well, and I suggest you prepare yourself for an evening that may prove rather momentous. Your friend, regardless of what society thinks, Amelia Pemberton." Eleanor had shown the invitation to Thomas during his next visit, and his response had been immediate and decisive. "You will attend," he said firmly, "and you will not go as the overlooked spinster who hides in corners. I have taken the liberty of commissioning a gown for you from Madame Beaumont, the modiste who serves the finest ladies in London. She has your measurements from a dress you had made there several years ago, and she assures me the gown will be ready in time for the ball." Eleanor had protested the extravagance, the impropriety of accepting such a gift, but Thomas had simply taken her hands and looked at her with such intensity that her objections had died in her throat. "Let me do this, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Let me give you the opportunity to enter a ballroom as you should have entered them 20 years ago, beautifully dressed and confident in your worth. Let me correct even this small part of what I failed to do then." And so Eleanor found herself on the evening of Lady Pemberton's ball, standing before her bedroom mirror in a gown more magnificent than anything she had ever worn, a creation of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue of her eyes and made her chestnut hair, now threaded with silver, seem lustrous rather than faded. The cut was elegant and age-appropriate, with long sleeves and a modest neckline. But the fabric itself was so fine and the fit so perfect that Eleanor barely recognized herself. Madame Beaumont had included gloves of the same sapphire silk and a simple strand of pearls that Thomas had sent over that morning, with a note explaining they had belonged to his mother and would suit Eleanor far better than they had ever suited Francesca. Charlotte had helped her dress, the girl's face glowing with excitement and pride, and when Eleanor descended the stairs, her niece had actually gasped. "Aunt Eleanor, you look like a duchess," she breathed, and Eleanor had felt tears prick her eyes at the unconscious prophecy in those words. The carriage Thomas had sent to collect her arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, far finer than anything Eleanor would have hired for herself, and as it carried her through the London streets toward Mayfair, she felt terror and exhilaration warring in her chest. She had not attended a ball in over 15 years, had long ago stopped accepting invitations to events where she would stand alone against the walls, and the prospect of walking into Lady Pemberton's glittering ballroom, knowing that every eye would be upon her, every tongue ready to dissect her appearance and speculate about the Duke's incomprehensible interest, made her want to tell the driver to turn around and take her home. But she thought of Thomas signing her dance cards, of his confession that he had watched her for an entire season, of his declaration that he would not lose another day to propriety, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin and prepared to face whatever judgment awaited her. The Pemberton townhouse blazed with light, every window illuminated by what must have been hundreds of candles, and the street outside was crowded with carriages disgorging elegantly dressed guests. Eleanor's arrival did not go unnoticed, several heads turning as she stepped from the Duke of Ashford's carriage, and she heard whispered speculation begin immediately. "Is that Eleanor Ashworth in Ashford's carriage? My God, she is wearing a fortune in silk, and those pearls, are those the Ashford family pearls? He has dressed her like a duchess." The scandal grows more brazen by the day. Eleanor ignored the whispers and made her way up the steps and into the grand entrance hall where Lady Pemberton herself stood receiving guests. Her friend's face lit with approval when she saw Eleanor, and she clasped both of Eleanor's hands warmly, speaking loudly enough that nearby guests could not help but overhear. "My dear Miss Ashworth, how magnificent you look this evening. That gown is perfection itself, and the color suits you wonderfully. I am so pleased you could attend." Eleanor felt gratitude wash through her at Lady Pemberton's public endorsement, the older woman using her social position to shield Eleanor from at least some of the cruel speculation. "Thank you for the invitation, Lady Pemberton," she said, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "You have always been a true friend." Lady Pemberton leaned in closer and whispered, so only Eleanor could hear. "The Duke arrived 10 minutes ago and has been watching the door like a hawk ever since. Go to him, my dear, and let society see what genuine devotion looks like." Then she released Eleanor's hands and turned to greet the next guests, leaving Eleanor to make her way toward the ballroom alone. The enormous double doors stood open, revealing a space that seemed designed to overwhelm the senses with its magnificence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ornate ceiling, their hundreds of candles creating a dazzling display of light that reflected off gilded mirrors and polished marble floors. The walls were hung with garlands of evergreen and white roses, their fragrance mixing with the scent of expensive perfumes and beeswax candles. Musicians occupied a raised platform at one end of the room, their instruments gleaming, and the space was already crowded with London's finest, the gentlemen in black evening dress, and the ladies in gowns of every colour imaginable, jewels glittering at throats and wrists and in elaborately dressed hair. Eleanor stood at the threshold and felt the past collide with the present, because this was exactly the scene she had observed from the margins 20 years ago, the glittering spectacle she had never quite been part of. But this time, instead of slinking toward the potted palms or the refreshment table, instead of positioning herself where she might disappear into the background, she walked into the ballroom with her head high and her eyes searching for only one face among the hundreds present. She found him almost immediately, as though some invisible thread connected them across the crowded space. Thomas stood near one of the tall windows, resplendent in formal evening dress that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, and the moment he saw her, his entire face transformed. He began moving toward her before she had taken more than a few steps into the room, and Eleanor was peripherally aware that conversations were stopping mid-sentence, that heads were turning to follow the Duke of Ashford's progress across the ballroom, that whispers were rising like a tide around them. He reached her and bowed formally, but his eyes held such warmth and devotion that Eleanor felt her terror begin to transmute into something else, something that felt remarkably like joy. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet space around them. "You are breathtaking this evening. That gown was made for you." Eleanor curtsied, conscious that they were performing for an audience, but caring less about propriety than she would have believed possible. "Your Grace," she said softly. "You are too kind." Thomas's eyes never left her face, and he extended his hand toward her in a gesture that was unmistakable in its intent. "Miss Ashworth, would you do me the very great honor of dancing with me?" The request sent a shock through the assembled crowd because the evening's dancing had not yet formally begun, because there were a dozen younger, more beautiful, more socially appropriate ladies present who might have expected the Duke's first attention, and most of all because everyone present knew that Eleanor Ashworth did not dance, had never danced, was the spinster who had spent her youth standing against walls while others waltzed. Eleanor looked at his extended hand and felt the weight of 20 years pressing down upon her, all the times she had watched others dance, all the blank lines on her dance cards, all the loneliness and longing she had carried in silence. But she also felt the strength of Thomas's confession, the validation of his signatures, the promise of his declaration that he would not be a coward again. She placed her hand in his, feeling his fingers close around hers with gentle firmness. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, and her voice emerged clear and steady despite the pounding of her heart. He led her onto the dance floor, and Eleanor was acutely aware that they were utterly alone in the center of the vast space, every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them, every person present holding their breath to see what would happen next. Thomas raised his hand in a subtle gesture toward the musicians, and they immediately began to play, the opening notes of a waltz filling the silence. And then his arm came around her waist, and she placed her hand on his shoulder, and they were moving together, spinning across the polished floor in time to music that seemed to swell around them like a benediction. Eleanor had learned to waltz decades ago from a dancing master her mother had hired, but she had never actually danced with a partner, had never felt the physical reality of being held and guided through the turns and steps. The sensation was overwhelming, the closeness of Thomas's body to hers, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way he led her effortlessly through the pattern, anticipating her movements and adjusting his own to accommodate her inexperience. She stumbled slightly on a turn, but he steadied her without breaking rhythm, his eyes encouraging her to trust him, to let him guide her. "I was a coward once," Thomas said quietly, speaking just loudly enough for her to hear over the music. "I will not be again." Marry me, Eleanor. The words struck her like a physical blow, and she nearly lost her footing entirely. Thomas, she breathed. People are watching. We are in the middle of a ballroom. Everyone can see us. Let them see, he said firmly, his arm tightening around her waist. Let them see that I choose you, Eleanor Ashworth, over every other woman in London. Let them see that I am claiming you publicly after hiding my feelings for 20 years. Let them see that their judgment and their gossip mean nothing to me compared to the possibility of spending whatever years I have left with the woman I should have chosen from the beginning. People will say you have lost your senses, Eleanor managed, even as tears began to stream down her face. Choosing an aging spinster over younger, beautiful women with fortunes and connections. They will say, I have bewitched you, that you are mad with grief, that this cannot possibly end well. Let them say whatever they wish, Thomas said, and she heard steel beneath the gentleness in his voice. I lost 20 years to propriety, Eleanor, 20 years to duty and obligation and cowardice. I will not lose another day. I love you, have loved you since I first saw you reading Milton behind the potted palm, and I intend to marry you if you will have me, regardless of what society thinks or says. The music swelled around them, and Eleanor felt the entire ballroom seem to contract until there was nothing but Thomas's grey eyes looking into hers, nothing but the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steady rhythm of their movement together. She thought of all the years she had spent believing herself unworthy of this, of love and devotion and public claiming, and she thought of the blank dance cards that now bore his signature on every line, and she knew with absolute certainty what her answer must be. Then, yes, she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. I will face whatever scandal comes, whatever judgment society levels, whatever price must be paid for choosing happiness over propriety. Yes, I will marry you and count myself the most fortunate woman in England, regardless of what anyone else thinks. His face transformed with joy so pure it made him look years younger, and for a moment Eleanor forgot entirely that they were in a ballroom surrounded by hundreds of people. Thomas pulled her fractionally closer, bending his head toward hers in a gesture that was not quite appropriate for a public dance, but which spoke volumes about his disregard for convention when it came to expressing what he felt. Around them, Eleanor became aware of a susurration of shocked whispers, the news of what had just transpired spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. The Duke of Ashford has just proposed to Eleanor Ashworth. On the dance floor, in front of everyone. She said yes. The spinster said yes to the Duke. How extraordinary. How utterly extraordinary. But Lady Pemberton's voice cut through the whispers, clear and authoritative. How perfectly right, you mean? The Duke of Ashford has excellent taste and more courage than most men half his age. I, for one, am delighted by this development. And as though Lady Pemberton's endorsement had broken a spell, other voices began to join in, not all supportive, but enough to shift the tenor of the room from purely scandalized to something more complex. The orchestra, sensing the dramatic moment, allowed the waltz to continue beyond its usual length, and gradually other couples began to join Eleanor and Thomas on the dance floor, some clearly in support of this unexpected union, others simply following the Duke's lead, because that was what society always did when a man of his rank set a precedent. Eleanor watched through tear-blurred eyes as the empty space around them filled with other dancers, as the ballroom that had seemed so hostile just moments before began to embrace them, and she felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what was possible. She was dancing, truly dancing for the first time in her life, held in the arms of a man who loved her and had just publicly declared his intention to marry her despite every social convention that said such a match was inappropriate. The physical space that had once excluded her so thoroughly now held her at its center, and instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable as she had feared, she felt celebrated, chosen, seen in a way that validated every hope she had secretly harbored. Thomas was smiling down at her with such unguarded happiness that Eleanor felt her own face responding in kind, and she realized with a start that she was happy, genuinely happy, in a way she had not been since she was a girl, too young to understand how cruel the world could be to women who did not fit its narrow definitions of worth. The waltz finally concluded, and as the final notes faded, Thomas led her to the edge of the dance floor, where Lady Pemberton waited with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Well done, both of you," she said quietly. "That was the bravest thing I have seen in 40 years of observing London society. Eleanor, my dear, you looked magnificent out there, and Your Grace." She turned to Thomas. "I applaud your courage in claiming publicly what you have clearly felt privately for far too long." Around them, guests were approaching to offer congratulations or express their shock in tones that ranged from genuinely warm to icily polite. Catherine appeared at one point, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, and she stared at Eleanor as though seeing her sister for the first time. "You actually did it," she said wonderingly. "You actually accepted a duke's proposal in the middle of a ballroom." Eleanor met her sister's eyes steadily, and she saw something shift in Catherine's expression, some grudging recognition that perhaps she had underestimated her plain older sister. "I did," Eleanor confirmed quietly. "And I would do it again, Catherine. I would choose Thomas over propriety every time because he sees my worth in a way that society never has and never will." Catherine opened her mouth as though to argue, then seemed to think better of it. She nodded once, curtly, and moved away, leaving Eleanor uncertain whether her sister's response constituted approval or merely acceptance of an irreversible reality. But Eleanor found she cared less about Catherine's opinion than she had expected, because Thomas's hand was warm in hers, and Lady Pemberton was beaming at them both, and the whispers around them had shifted from purely scandalized to something more nuanced, something that acknowledged the romantic drama of what had just occurred, even if many present still found the match incomprehensible. As the evening progressed, and Eleanor stood beside Thomas, receiving the various reactions of London society, she caught glimpses of herself reflected in the enormous gilded mirrors that lined the ballroom walls. The woman looking back at her was not the invisible wallflower or the resigned spinster, but someone transformed by love and public claiming into a version of herself she had never quite believed possible. The deep sapphire gown caught the candlelight, the Ashford pearls gleamed at her throat, and Thomas stood protectively close, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture of possession and devotion that declared to everyone present that he had chosen her and would not be swayed by their judgment. The ballroom that had once represented her deepest humiliation had become the setting for her greatest triumph, and Eleanor felt the symbolism of it settle into her bones like a blessing. She had been invisible in spaces like this for so long that being seen, being celebrated, being publicly claimed by a duke who ignored younger and more conventionally beautiful women in favor of her, felt like a vindication of every instinct she had ever had that she was worth more than society's assessment. And as the music played and the candles burned and London's elite continued to process the shock of the Duke of Ashford's extraordinary proposal to the aging spinster Eleanor Ashworth, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face or gossip they would endure, this moment would sustain her. This public correction of her past invisibility would carry her through any trial, because Thomas had given her not just his love, but his public devotion, and that, Eleanor understood, was the greatest gift of all. The 3 months between Thomas's public proposal at the Pemberton Ball and their wedding in early March passed in a blur of preparations that Eleanor navigated with a mixture of anticipation and surreal disbelief. As though at any moment she might wake to find the entire series of events had been an elaborate dream conjured by her loneliness. Thomas had insisted on a short engagement, despite society's raised eyebrows, declaring that he had already wasted 20 years and would not add unnecessary months to that tally, and Eleanor, who had spent decades accommodating others' preferences, found herself delighting in the novelty of making decisions based solely on what she and Thomas wanted, rather than what convention dictated. They had chosen to marry at the chapel on Thomas's estate in Sussex rather than in London, deliberately avoiding the spectacle that a society wedding would have entailed, and the guest list numbered fewer than 30 people, comprised entirely of those whose regard they genuinely valued. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect early spring days when the last chill of winter has lifted. But the heat of summer remains distant, and Eleanor stood at the window of her guest chamber in Ashford House, watching cherry blossoms drift past on a gentle breeze like pink snow. She had spent the previous night at the estate as tradition required, Thomas having taken rooms at the nearby inn so they might observe the superstition about the groom not seeing the bride before the ceremony, and she had barely slept, her mind too full of wonder and gratitude and the persistent disbelief that she, Eleanor Ashworth, spinster of 38 years, was about to become the Duchess of Ashford. Lady Pemberton had arrived the evening before and had appointed herself Eleanor's attendant, insisting on helping her dress and ensuring every detail was perfect, and the older woman bustled into the chamber now with the air of someone on a beloved mission. "My dear Eleanor," she said warmly, "you look positively luminous this morning. I have never seen you so happy, and it does my heart good to witness it." Eleanor turned from the window and smiled at her friend, the woman who had maintained faith in her worth when society had written her off as a permanent wallflower. "I keep expecting to wake up, Amelia," she confessed quietly. "I keep thinking this cannot possibly be real, that women like me do not get endings like this." Lady Pemberton crossed to her and took both her hands, her expression tender but firm. "Women like you, my dear, are the ones who most deserve endings like this, because you have earned your happiness through decades of grace and dignity in the face of unkindness. Now come, let us get you into your gown and transformed into the bride Thomas has been counting the minutes to see." Eleanor had chosen to wear the sapphire gown from the Pemberton Ball rather than having a new dress made, a decision that had initially scandalized the modiste, but which felt profoundly right to Eleanor. This was the gown she had worn when Thomas first claimed her publicly, the dress in which she had accepted his proposal and danced for the first time in her life, and wearing it again felt like a continuation of that transformative moment rather than a separate event. Lady Pemberton had commissioned a delicate veil of Brussels lace to complement the gown, and as she arranged it over Eleanor's hair, now dressed in a softer style that allowed silver-threaded chestnut curls to frame her face, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the looking-glass and felt her breath catch. The woman reflected there was not the resigned spinster, or even the cautiously hopeful woman who had received Thomas in her modest drawing-room, but someone transformed by love and validation into a version of herself she had never quite believed possible. Someone beautiful not because she had suddenly acquired conventional prettiness, but because she was thoroughly, completely happy. The chapel at Ashford House was small and ancient, its stone walls having witnessed marriages and christenings and funerals for over 400 years, and when Lady Pemberton led Eleanor through the arched doorway, the intimate space was filled with soft spring light filtering through stained glass windows that cast pools of color across the worn flagstones. The pews held the handful of guests they had invited, Lady Pemberton's husband, a few of Thomas's closest friends, Charlotte looking radiant in a new dress that Thomas had insisted on providing, and in the front pew, looking smaller and more uncertain than Eleanor had ever seen her, Catherine. Eleanor's sister had written 3 weeks after the engagement announcement requesting permission to call, and when she had arrived at Eleanor's townhouse, she had done something Eleanor had never witnessed in all their years as siblings. She had wept. Catherine had apologized for decades of casual cruelty, for the unconscious dismissiveness with which she had treated Eleanor's unmarried state, for the assumption that beauty and early success in the marriage market conferred some sort of moral superiority. She had confessed that her own marriage had brought her none of the happiness she had expected, that Lord Hartwell valued her appearance, but cared nothing for her thoughts or feelings, and that watching Eleanor find genuine love with a man who treasured her mind and spirit had forced Catherine to confront the emptiness of her own supposedly successful life. Eleanor had listened with compassion rather than triumph, and she had forgiven her sister with a grace that came from finally understanding that Catherine's cruelty had stemmed from her own insecurity, her desperate need to maintain her position as the superior sister, because she had nothing else to anchor her sense of worth. Now Catherine sat in the chapel looking up at Eleanor with an expression that held genuine joy mixed with something that looked like wonder, as though she were witnessing a transformation she had never believed possible, and which challenged everything she had understood about how the world worked. But Eleanor's attention was drawn inexorably forward to where Thomas stood at the altar waiting for her, and when their eyes met, she saw such love and devotion reflected there that she felt tears begin to gather, though she refused to let them fall and mar this perfect moment. He looked distinguished and handsome in his formal attire, the silver in his hair catching the colored light from the stained glass, and when she reached his side and he took her hand, she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like a benediction. The ceremony itself was brief and traditional, the ancient words of the marriage service taking on new meaning when spoken by 2 people who had waited half a lifetime to claim each other, and when the vicar finally pronounced them man and wife, Thomas lifted her veil with hands that trembled slightly and kissed her with a tenderness that made the small congregation sigh collectively. Eleanor felt the kiss through her entire body, felt the promise and devotion it contained, and when they finally separated and turned to face their guests as the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, she saw Lady Pemberton dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Catherine smiling through her own tears, and Charlotte clapping her hands with unrestrained joy. The wedding breakfast was held in the smaller of Ashford House's dining rooms, an intimate space that could comfortably accommodate their modest party, and Eleanor found herself seated at Thomas's right hand, being toasted and congratulated by people who genuinely cared for her happiness rather than those who had come merely to observe and judge. Catherine approached her during a quiet moment when Thomas had stepped away to speak with the vicar, and Eleanor's sister took her hands with a grip that was almost desperate. "Eleanor, I need to say this before my courage fails," Catherine began, her voice unsteady. "I was cruel to you for so many years, cruel in my ignorance and my assumption that my path was the only valuable one. I watched you stand alone at balls and told myself you preferred it that way, that you were odd and bookish and content with your solitude. Because acknowledging your loneliness would have required me to examine my own role in perpetuating it. I dismissed your accomplishments, your intelligence, your worth, because I needed to believe that beauty and an early marriage were the only measures of success. Can you forgive me? Truly forgive me. Not just with words, but in your heart." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hands and felt no trace of the old resentment or hurt, only compassion for the woman before her who was finally beginning to question the values she had built her life around. "We were both prisoners of different kinds, Catherine," she said gently. "You were imprisoned by the need to maintain your position as the beautiful one, the successful one. and I was imprisoned by the belief that I was fundamentally unworthy of love. I am free now." She gestured to Thomas across the room, to the intimate gathering celebrating their union, to the joy that suffused her entire being. "I hope you will find your own freedom too, whatever form that takes." Catherine's tears spilled over then, and she pulled Eleanor into an embrace that felt different from any they had shared before, stripped of the condescension and pity that had always colored their interactions. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being more gracious than I deserve." When the wedding breakfast concluded and the guests began to depart, Thomas took Eleanor's hand and led her to the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and featuring tall windows that overlooked the estate's gardens where spring flowers were just beginning to bloom. "Wait here," he said, kissing her forehead with lingering tenderness. "I have a wedding gift for you, and I want to present it in private." He disappeared through a door that led to his study and returned moments later carrying a large leather-bound album, its cover tooled in gold with her new initials, EBA, Eleanor Bancroft, Duchess of Ashford. He set it on the reading table near the window where afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, creating a pool of golden light, and he gestured for her to sit. "I cannot give you back the years we lost, my love," he said quietly as she lowered herself into the chair he held for her. "But I can honor them, and promise you all the years remaining. This is my attempt to do both." Eleanor opened the album with trembling fingers and felt her breath stop entirely at what she saw. The first page held the dance card from the Montrose ball, mounted carefully on heavy cream paper and protected by a layer of tissue, every line still bearing Thomas's bold signature. But beside the card was something she had not expected. A small watercolor painting, exquisitely detailed, showing a ballroom scene from 1838. In the foreground, a young woman in a pale green dress waltzed in the arms of a tall, dark-haired gentleman, and Eleanor recognized with a shock that the woman was her, or rather an idealized version of her, painted with such care and attention that she appeared genuinely beautiful, her face alight with joy, her form graceful in the gentleman's arms. The painting captured not how Eleanor had looked in reality, standing alone against the wall, but how she would have looked if Thomas had found the courage to ask her to dance, and the artist had somehow managed to convey in brushstrokes what Thomas must have described in words, the connection between the dancing couple, the way they looked at each other as though no one else existed, the perfect rightness of their partnership. "You commissioned this," Eleanor breathed, her fingers hovering over the painting as though afraid to touch it and discover it was not real. "Thomas, this must have cost a fortune." He knelt beside her chair, his hand covering hers. "I hired an artist and described to him in detail what each ball was like, what you wore, where you stood, and most importantly, what it would have looked like if we had danced together as we should have. He painted 12 scenes, one for each of your dance cards, showing us waltzing through the season we were denied. Turn the page, my love." With shaking hands, Eleanor turned to the next page and found the Cavendish ball card, its lines filled with Thomas's signatures, accompanied by another watercolor showing them dancing in a different setting, Eleanor in the ivory silk with seed pearls, Thomas's hand at her waist, both of them captured mid-turn with expressions of profound happiness. Page after page revealed the same pattern, each signed dance card preserved and mounted, each accompanied by a painting of the dance that should have been, and Eleanor felt tears streaming freely down her face as she witnessed herself transformed through Thomas's eyes from the invisible wallflower to the cherished partner, from the woman no one asked, to the woman this man had desperately wanted to ask, but lacked the courage to approach. The Pemberton Musicale showed them dancing beneath crystal chandeliers. The Hartley Ball depicted them in a garden setting during an outdoor waltz. The Worthington Garden Party captured them among roses and fountains, and each painting was executed with such skill and attention that Eleanor could almost hear the music, almost feel Thomas's hand guiding her through steps she had never actually taken. The Huntington masquerade showed her as Athena, with Thomas as a mysterious figure in a dark mask, and the final ball of the season at the Cavendish house depicted them in the closing waltz, both looking slightly older and wiser, as though the artist had understood that by June they had both already begun to recognize what they were losing by not claiming each other. "You have given me the dances we never had," Eleanor said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You have rewritten history, not just with signatures, but with images that show how it should have been, how we should have been. Thomas, this is the most extraordinary gift anyone has ever given me." He touched her face gently, wiping away tears with his thumb. "You deserve to see yourself as I saw you then, and as I see you now, Eleanor. Not as the overlooked wallflower or the aging spinster, but as the woman whose intelligence and grace and quiet strength captivated me from the first moment I glimpsed you. These paintings show what my eyes saw, even when my courage failed to act on what my heart knew." Eleanor turned to the final page of the album and found not a dance card or a painting, but a blank cream page with just 2 lines drawn in Thomas's hand, and beneath them a note written in his distinctive script. "For all the dances yet to come, the dances that matter most, the dances we will actually share, growing old together, loving each other through whatever years remain. These are the dances I promise you, Eleanor, not imagined scenes from a past we cannot change, but real moments in a future we will build together." She closed the album carefully and turned to Thomas, pulling him up from his kneeling position and into her arms, holding him with a fierceness that surprised them both. "You have given me something more precious than time," she said against his shoulder. "You have given me the knowledge that I was never invisible. I was simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes, and those eyes belonged to you all along." They stood thus in the library, the afternoon sun warming them through the tall windows, the album resting on the table like a bridge between past and future, and Eleanor felt a completeness settle over her that she had never imagined possible. The dance cards that had once been evidence of her invisibility had been transformed into monuments of hidden devotion, and the blank page waiting for dances yet to come represented a promise that the rest of their lives would be spent actually dancing together rather than watching from separate distances. When they finally separated, Thomas took her hand and led her to the window overlooking the gardens. "Shall we go for a walk?" he asked. "It is a beautiful afternoon, and I would like to show you the estate that is now your home." Eleanor smiled and nodded, but before they left the library, she turned back to look once more at the album resting in its pool of sunlight, at the physical manifestation of Thomas's devotion and the artist's skill, at the record of dances that had existed only in Thomas's imagination and memory until he found the courage to make them visible. The album would remain in the Ashford Library for the rest of their lives, a testament to what had been lost and what had been found, to courage delayed but finally claimed, to love that had waited 20 years to be acknowledged, and which would now have the chance to flourish in the time that remained. And as Eleanor took Thomas's arm, and they walked together through the house that was now hers, past servants who bowed and called her "Your Grace," out into gardens where cherry blossoms continued to drift like pink snow, she understood that the real wedding gift was not the album itself, beautiful and meaningful as it was, but the future it represented, the blank page waiting to be filled with actual dances, actual moments of connection and joy, and the deep satisfaction of 2 people who had found each other against all odds and who intended to treasure every remaining day of their improbable, extraordinary second chance. 1 year later, on a mild March evening that marked the anniversary of their wedding, Eleanor stood at the window of the London townhouse on Clarges Street, watching the lamplighters make their rounds, her hand resting absently on the swell of her belly where their child grew. A development so unexpected that even now, at 39 years old and 5 months into her pregnancy, she occasionally touched her abdomen to confirm the reality of it. They had kept the modest townhouse despite Thomas's protests that a duchess should not maintain such humble lodgings, but Eleanor had insisted, arguing that this was the place where he had first called upon her, where he had signed her dance cards, where they had built the foundation of their marriage through honest conversation and hard-won courage, and she could not bear to relinquish it entirely, even though they now spent most of their time at Ashford House in Sussex. Thomas had eventually conceded, understanding that his wife needed this retreat, this tangible connection to the woman she had been before becoming a duchess, and they had furnished it comfortably and used it whenever they had business in London or simply wanted the intimacy of the smaller space where their love had first been acknowledged. The anniversary dinner they had hosted that evening had been a small affair, just Lady Pemberton and her husband, a few close friends who had supported them through the scandal of their engagement and the gradual acceptance of their marriage, and Charlotte, who now lived primarily at Ashford House under Eleanor's guardianship, after Catherine had finally admitted that her daughter deserved better than to witness the slow disintegration of the Hartwell marriage. Lady Pemberton had offered a toast during dinner that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, raising her glass and declaring in her forthright way, "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, the couple who proved it is never too late for love, never too late for courage, and never too late to claim the happiness that society insists should be reserved only for the young and conventionally beautiful. May you have many more years together, and may the child Eleanor carries know from the first breath that worth is not determined by others' judgments, but by the content of one's character and the courage to live authentically." The guests had departed an hour ago, Charlotte had retired to her room, and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet of evening. But Eleanor found herself too restless for sleep, despite the fatigue that pregnancy often brought. She had climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, drawn by an impulse she could not fully explain, and she stood now in the dusty space looking at the camphor-wood box that still resided here, though its contents had been transformed. The original dance cards remained in the box alongside the leather-bound album Thomas had given her as a wedding gift, and Eleanor opened the box now, lifting out one of the cards and studying Thomas's bold signature repeated across every line, still awed by the physical evidence of his devotion, even after a year of marriage had made that devotion a daily reality. She heard footsteps on the attic stairs and turned to see Thomas emerging into the space, his silver hair slightly disheveled from removing his evening coat, his cravat loosened, looking more relaxed and approachable than the formal duke who had presided over their anniversary dinner. "I thought I might find you here," he said, crossing to her side and placing a hand gently on her belly in the gesture that had become habitual since they had learned of the pregnancy. "What draws you to this attic on our anniversary, my love? Are you melancholy?" Eleanor leaned into his touch, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Not melancholy," she said quietly. "Reflective, perhaps. I was thinking about the woman I was when I first showed you these cards, how desperate I was for validation, how much I needed proof that I had not been invisible all those years. And I was thinking about the woman I am now, who no longer needs that proof because I carry the knowledge of my worth inside me, rather than seeking it from external sources." Thomas's arm came around her shoulders, careful of her changed shape, and he pulled her close. "You were always worthy, Eleanor," he said firmly. "I simply had the privilege of recognizing what was already there." She smiled at his characteristic generosity, but shook her head slightly. "No, Thomas, I was not always worthy, not in the way I am now. I had intelligence and dignity and a kind of stubborn resilience. Yes, but I also had bitterness and resignation and a belief that I was fundamentally less than. You did not just recognize my worth, you helped me claim it, helped me understand that being overlooked was not a reflection of my inadequacy, but a failure of others' vision. There is a difference between possessing worth and knowing you possess it. And you gave me the latter. He was quiet for a moment, his hand absently rubbing her back in slow circles. "Do you ever regret that we did not find each other sooner?" he asked finally, his voice carrying an old pain that Eleanor recognized as the regret he still carried for their lost years. "Do you wish we had been brave enough 20 years ago to claim what we both felt?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him fully, studying his beloved face with its lines of age and sorrow and the new lines of happiness that their year together had begun to etch. "Every day," she admitted honestly, "every day I think about the dances we might have shared, the conversations we might have had, the years we might have spent building a life together instead of living in separate exils." But then she reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of evening stubble beneath her palm, and I remember that we might not have been ready for each other then. You were bound by obligation and family duty, and I was too wounded by invisibility to believe I deserved genuine love. Perhaps we needed those years to become who we are now, to earn the wisdom to recognize what matters and the courage to claim it regardless of society's judgment. Thomas caught her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You are wiser than I deserve," he murmured. "I am still learning to forgive myself for my cowardice, but you are right that perhaps our youth would not have served us as well as our age has. We know what we have because we know what we lost, and that knowledge makes us treasure each day in a way younger versions of ourselves might not have managed." Eleanor looked at the box of dance cards sitting open on the dusty shelf, at the album beside it with its watercolor paintings of dances that had existed only in imagination until Thomas made them visible, and she felt a profound sense of completion. "The cards were empty so you could fill them," she said softly. "My life was waiting so you could complete it." Thomas's expression shifted to something fierce and tender at once. "No, my love," he said urgently. "You were already complete. I simply had the privilege of witnessing it, of being allowed into the world you had built through your own strength and grace. You did not need me to make you whole, Eleanor. You needed someone who could see that you already were whole, and I happened to be fortunate enough to have eyes clear enough to recognize what others missed." She felt tears gather at his words, at the validation they offered not just of her worth, but of her capacity to exist fully and completely, even in the absence of romantic partnership. "Dance with me," she said impulsively. "Here, now, in this attic where I first showed you the cards, and where you first understood the full extent of my invisible youth. Dance with me in the place where our story truly began." Thomas's face transformed with surprised delight. "There is no music, my darling, and the space is hardly suitable for waltzing, and you are 5 months pregnant, which makes graceful movement rather challenging." Eleanor laughed, the sound rich and free and utterly unlike the careful, guarded woman she had been just over a year ago. "Then we will make do with humming, and we will dance ungracefully, and we will bump my belly between us and laugh at the absurdity of it all. This is the dance I will remember, Thomas, not the perfect waltz at the Pemberton ball or the elegant first dance at our wedding breakfast, but this one, here, now, with no witnesses and no music and nothing but the choice we make every day to be present with each other in the small, imperfect moments that actually comprise a life." He smiled and pulled her into his arms, adjusting his hold to accommodate the swell of her pregnancy, and began to hum a waltz the melody slightly off-key but recognizable as the same waltz they had danced to at the Pemberton ball when he had proposed so publicly. Eleanor rested one hand on his shoulder and allowed him to take her other hand in his, and they began to move slowly through the dusty attic, their steps uncoordinated and frequently interrupted when her belly bumped against him or when one of them stumbled over an uneven floorboard. They laughed when she nearly tripped over a stack of old books, and Thomas steadied her with exaggerated care, and they swayed more than they actually danced. But Eleanor felt more joy in this clumsy, imperfect moment than she had felt in any of the more polished social occasions they had navigated together. "This is what matters," she said, her voice soft but certain. Not the grand gestures or the public declarations, though those had their place. But this, being chosen every day in moments no one else sees, being loved not because I am a duchess now, or because society has decided to accept our marriage, but simply because you want to dance with me in an attic with terrible lighting and no music and a pregnant belly making everything awkward. Thomas's humming faltered and stopped, and he pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "You have taught me more about what matters than I taught you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I thought I understood love and devotion, but you have shown me that it is found in exactly these moments, in choosing each other not when it is easy or impressive, but when it is simply real." She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of him, sandalwood and bergamot, and something uniquely Thomas. And she felt their child move between them, a flutter of life that seemed to bless this moment with its tiny presence. "We made a person," she marveled, as she did every time she felt that sensation. "We who were both convinced we would live out our lives alone have somehow created a life together. I am 39 years old, Thomas, and I am going to be a mother. Lady Pemberton says it is scandalous and wonderful in equal measure." His hand moved to her belly, splaying across the swell protectively. "Our child will know from the first moment that worth is not determined by whether you are chosen early or late, by whether you are beautiful or plain, by whether society approves or condemns," he said firmly. "Our child will grow up understanding that happiness delayed is not happiness denied, and that courage can be found at any age if one is willing to risk judgment for the sake of genuine connection." They stood swaying gently in the gathering dusk, the light from the single window fading to deep blue, and Eleanor looked around the attic that had been witness to so many pivotal moments in her life. Here she had hidden as a young woman, nursing her wounded pride and convincing herself she preferred solitude to the pain of continued rejection. Here she had sat with Charlotte just over a year ago, explaining why she had kept blank dance cards as evidence of her invisible youth. Here Thomas had found her examining those same cards the night before their wedding, and he had told her that the past no longer had the power to define her unless she allowed it to. The box sat open on the shelf now, no longer a shrine to pain, but a reminder of the journey she had traveled from invisibility to recognition, from resignation to hope, from believing herself fundamentally unworthy to understanding that her worth had always existed, waiting only for someone with clear enough vision to acknowledge it. The album rested beside the box, its watercolor paintings capturing dances that had never happened, but which represented Thomas's devotion more powerfully than any real dance could have, because he had imagined them, described them, commissioned an artist to make them visible when they had existed only in his memory and regret. And now, 1 year into their marriage and 5 months into an unexpected pregnancy, Eleanor understood that these artifacts, precious as they were, no longer held the same power over her. She had moved beyond needing proof of her visibility, beyond requiring external validation of her worth, because Thomas's daily choice of her his consistent presence. His ungrudging love had given her something more valuable than signed cards or beautiful paintings. It had given her the certainty that she was seen, known, and cherished for exactly who she was. "I am happy," she said, the simple declaration carrying more weight than any elaborate profession of emotion. "I am 39 years old, pregnant, married to a man who watched me from across ballrooms 20 years ago and finally found the courage to claim me. And I am happier than I ever imagined possible. Not because my circumstances have changed, though they have, but because I have changed. Because you helped me see myself as you saw me, as someone worthy of devotion and joy, and all the small, precious moments that comprise a well-lived life." Thomas resumed his humming, pulling her back into their clumsy waltz, and Eleanor laughed as her belly bumped against him again, throwing off their rhythm entirely. They danced badly in the dusty attic, two people who had found each other 20 years too late and discovered it was actually exactly on time. And below them, London continued its indifferent bustle, carriages rattling through streets and vendors calling their final wares, and all the ordinary business of life proceeding without pause or notice. But here, in this small space above the city's noise, Eleanor and Thomas created their own world, one where age was an asset rather than a liability, where past pain could be redeemed through present courage, where second chances existed for those brave enough to claim them. The box of signed dance cards would remain on the shelf, treasured but no longer needed. Because Eleanor had learned that being chosen was not what gave her worth, but rather what revealed the worth that had always been there, waiting for someone with eyes clear enough to see it. And as they swayed together in the failing light, their movements uncoordinated and frequently interrupted by laughter, Eleanor understood that this moment, this quiet dance in an attic with no music and no witnesses, was the one that would sustain her through whatever years remained, because it represented the truth at the heart of their improbable love. That being seen, truly seen, in the small, unglamorous moments was more precious than any grand gesture, and that two people damaged by time and circumstance could choose each other daily and find in that choosing a happiness that transcended every limitation society tried to impose. The dance ended as clumsily as it had begun, both of them slightly out of breath, and Thomas guided Eleanor to sit on an old trunk near the window where the last of the evening light illuminated her face. He knelt before her, his hands on her belly, and looked up at her with such devotion that she felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for keeping those blank dance cards all those years so I could eventually sign them. Thank you for having the courage to receive me when I finally found you again. Thank you for choosing me despite everything that made our union improbable. And thank you for teaching me that love is not about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about showing up every day in whatever way we can manage, broken pieces and all." Eleanor reached down to frame his face with her hands, feeling the dampness of tears on his cheeks, and she smiled through her own tears. "The cards were empty so you could fill them," she said, "and my life was waiting, not incomplete but ready, for someone who could see what was already there and celebrate it rather than trying to change it. You gave me that, Thomas. You gave me the gift of being seen, and I will spend the rest of our life together making certain you feel equally seen, equally valued, equally cherished." They sat thus as full darkness fell, and the stars began to appear beyond the attic window. Two people who had wasted 20 years and found that the waste had taught them what mattered, and in the box on the shelf, the signed dance cards rested peacefully, monuments not to invisibility overcome, but to devotion acknowledged, to courage delayed, but finally claimed, to love that had waited patiently through decades of exile and had finally, gloriously, improbably, found its way home.